Chapter 9, Column AE, Imaginary Incidents. One of the social aberrations of America is that imagining things is a misconduct. Imagining things has been made equivalent to insanity. It is a common derogatory statement to say that one is imagining things. It is a nullifying criticism to say that one experiences delusion. The child is particularly subject to a bombardment of criticism for being imaginative. The condemnation of imagination signifies a fear of a departure from reality. But if imagination is so thoroughly condemned, then those who condemn it must have some basic fear that they themselves cannot hold on to a reality. There is nothing wrong with imagination. There is a great deal wrong with the type of aberration which makes it impossible or at least difficult for the individual to differentiate between the imaginary and the actual. So long as the individual knows he is imagining when he is imagining, and he knows he is dealing in fact when he is dealing in fact, imagination has a high validity. There are three types of imagination. One is creative imagination, whereby in the field of aesthetics, the urges and impulses of the various dynamics are interwoven into new scenes and ideas. The second type is the more or less practical type of imagination, which comes about as a result of computation. Without this second type of imagination, an individual could not forecast the future, nor could he postulate a goal desirable in the future. This type of imagination is so vital to computation that individual who lacks it can be seen to be definitely deficient analytically. The third type of imagination is delusionary or hallucinatory. If the culture desired to make itself more sane, it would cease to apply the word imaginary to things which are delusionary or hallucinatory. Delusion connotes a type of imagination which is not known by the individual to be imaginary. However, in engrams, one commonly runs into the phrases, "It's all your imagination," "It's all in your head," "You're just imagining things," and other command phrases which short-circuit the pre-clear's ability to differentiate between what we should now call the imaginary and the hallucinatory. The imagination becomes hooked into the fact bank, and I receives data as fact, which is actually the product of imagination. There are, one could say, four distinct sources of aberration. The first is occasioned by phrases in engrams, which specifically dictate certain obsessions, compulsions, repressions, delusions, neuroses, and psychoses. Such phrases, however, have command value on the analyzer, which does not know they exist below it in the reactive mind, only to the degree that the case is charged with n theta. Command phrases and action phrases become more and more obeyed by the analyzer the more the analyzer is shut down through cumulative aberration. Action phrases are effective more and more as the individual descends on the tone scale. Therefore, there is a second type of aberration source, which is simply the amount of charge there is on the case. This might be called mechanical aberration. It does not stem from specific commands, but stems from mental inefficiency by reason of cumulative n theta. As the pre-clear descends down the tone scale, certain definite manifestations take place by reason of cumulative n theta. The whole chart around which this book is written is a result of the study of the effect of accumulating n theta on aberrated individuals. N theta by itself can charge up a case to the point where the case will behave in certain definite ways regardless of the command content of the engrams. The third kind of aberration is environmental and is the result of aberrated persons and situations in the individual's present time environment. This is normally temporary, but cumulative environmental n theta has a chronic effect in the case. The fourth type of aberration is educational, being the cumulative n theta of the culture in which the pre-clear was raised, the irrationalities and bad data he has received as a result of his education by parents, in schools, and by experience. There should be listed a fifth type of aberration and even a sixth and seventh type, but these are at this time of less concern to the auditor. The fifth type would be the cumulative aberration of the theta body through its many generations, which he may or may not have to address in the clearing of the case. The sixth type would be the pattern behavior inherited on the genetic line, of which very little is known, but it can be estimated that any organism has some pattern behavior of which some small portion might be considered incorrect for the environment, and so, by a stretch of definition, could be considered aberration. The seventh type would be aberration due to missing or malformed portions of the human structure, either through genetic inheritance or through accident or psychosurgery. Thus, we see that imagination is valuable and vital, both to creating tomorrow's realities in the society, the invaluable contribution of the artist, writer, and composer, and in the practical computations of everyday living, and that it should not be discounted in value in the rational human being. Then we see that imagination by engrammic command, which confuses the real with the unreal without proper evaluation, can introduce falsity into the thinking and execution of the individual. Additionally, we have imagination, by reason of charge on a case, beginning to supplant reality as the case descends down the tone scale. Imagination thus becomes mechanically more and more short-circuited into a supplantation of reality as the position of the individual decreases on the scale. In the past, it was thought that people imagined things willfully in order to escape reality. These therapies never bothered to evaluate reality, but were very glib in demanding that people face it. Escape and delusion were epithets used in order to pound the patient into obedient subjugation. The practice of telling the patient that his incidents are imaginary rapidly reduces the individual on the tone scale, since it destroys the patient's sense of reality and is a practice definitely calculated to further incapacitate the patient. The fact of the matter seems to be that as an individual drops down the tone scale, the cumulative charge on the case makes existence in its actual form more and more intolerable. What theta he has left, perhaps because of reversed polarity, cannot perceive into the end theta of the reactive mind and the mostly shut-down analyzer. It is not that the person is unwilling to face reality, it is that he is incapable of facing reality. Said in another way, the individual is veered away from the things which have been done to him in life, toward imaginary postulates which can serve in lieu of fact. It is true enough that the individual who cannot feel that he is a threat to the enemies in his environment, at least to some degree, is insane or becomes insane. Thus, as the individual descends on the tone scale, he becomes, by imagination, first a threat to real things, and then, by imagination, a threat to imaginary things, and finally, no threat at all to anything, at which point he has reached pretended death. Thus the individual departs further and further from reality, at first knowing that he is departing from reality, and then being unaware that he is departing from reality, at which point he could be considered to some degree insane. A possible explanation for the short-circuiting of imagination by the mechanical means of cumulative charge on a case may be of interest to the auditor. There is no good description, and indeed no accurate postulate or theory which accounts for the ability of the human mind to remember in the quantity that it does. The most recent attempt was made by a person who had dabbled in physical structure, but who did not know his mathematics. He originated a punched protein molecule theory and stated that memory charges were stored in punched protein molecules. His theory holds up only so long as it takes one to work out by mathematics that if an individual recorded only the major perceptions of his environment day after day and stored them by this theory of holes in molecules in which are stored memories, he would still have in storage capacity only enough in the 10 to the 21st power binary digits of cells the brain contains to serve for 3 months of memory. Therefore, this theory of punched protein molecules is not valid. It was my privilege to take one of the earliest courses given at an American university in atomic and molecular phenomena. My purpose was not, however, the same as that of some of the other students in the course who went on to make atomic fission practical and give us the atom bomb. I was trying to find life force as an energy. Studies and experiments at that time, 1931, brought me to the conclusion that physical universe energy did not account for human memory, because there was no wavelength small enough nor possible basic unit of human structure small enough to account for the vast storage of memory of which the mind is capable. While further studies in the next 2 decades brought about these concepts of Dianetics and some ideas and axioms concerning thought energy, this field is now but barely entered and should receive the attention it deserves. The bare entrance which has been made into this field has already given us a better understanding of man, aberration, and human conduct than we have ever had before. But the surface is so faintly scratched that great benefits should accrue from a thorough and continuous penetration of this new universe. A workable analogy on the subject of structure, and it should remain an analogy only, since it does not do any more than help a person understand what is happening, tells us that we may be dealing in memory and in the human computer with a problem not unlike physical universe electrical charges surrounded by insulation. Certain things tear down this insulation so that memory items begin to short-circuit one to another. This would account for the identification of one fact with another, which occurs more and more as the tone scale is descended. Low on the tone scale, things are identified with other things which are actually widely different. But at the higher levels of the tone scale, where the mind is in good working condition and there is no great charge on the case, minute differences can be detected by the computer between one memory item and another. At the top of the scale, the mind is capable, for instance, of differentiating between two cigarettes, which, though they appear identical and are of an identical brand, are different if only to the degree that they occupy different units of space. At the bottom end of the tone scale, not only would these two cigarettes seem to be the same cigarette, but these two cigarettes would also be tobacco, which would also be tobacco smoke, which would also be chewing tobacco, which would mean that chewing equaled a house on fire. At the top of the tone scale, at the highest levels of reason, one has sharp, high-level differentiation between facts. And at the lower end of the tone scale, the most widely different facts and items are associated as equal. One could say that the equation of the reactive mind was A equals A equals A equals A, regardless of what A stood for. In an engram, all things and remarks are equal to each other, are equal to the pain, are equal to the perceptics, and hearing equals vision, and vision equals tactile, and a complete identification occurs. The analyzer, when full on, thinks in minute differences. The ability to think has to do with the ability to differentiate. Unthinkingness has to do with a lack of ability to differentiate, and a compulsion to identify unlike things with each other as though they were not only like things, but the same thing. In an insane person, the administration of sedation seems to bring about a momentary recurrence of sanity. As an analogy only, then, it could be said that N theta breaks down the structural insulation, separating one memory item or unit from another, and so causes identification. And it could be said that the presence of any euphoria would rebuild or reestablish this insulation to some degree and make rational thinking possible. The auditor who audits a pre-clear who is under sedation will discover that so long as the pre-clear is under sedation, he appears to be responding to treatment. But the moment the sedation wears off, all the auditing and most of the N theta which was thought to be turned into theta have now become short-circuited into brand new aberration. Probably the most dangerous thing one can do to an insane person or to any aberrated mind is to place it under heavy sedation and try to treat it. Or while it is under sedation, place it in an atmosphere which is restimulative. Sedation of the insane is shortly and abruptly criminal, since it permits new perceptics to become entangled with an already confused mind under circumstances of perception which, if the patient were not under sedation, could not take place. It should be thoroughly understood that this analogy of insulation between memory units in the mind is very definitely an analogy and is used for illustration only so that the auditor may know better what he is confronting. N theta definitely seems to tear down and arc across any divisional and insulatory barriers in the mind. As a further analogy, it could be postulated that as the mind breaks down in its ability to differentiate and begins more and more to identify, the various units of the analyzer begin themselves to become too closely associated and begin to replace each other, so that that portion of the mind which is used for imagination becomes undifferentiated from that portion of the mind which is doing computation on fact. This would also be an analogy which took place regarding valences, wherein the I, which is the real individual, becomes obliterated in favor of highly charged other sections of the analyzer. And here the analogy breaks down, since the valence walls between different personalities the individual may be grow more and more sharply defined as the individual descends on the tone scale, so that at last the heavily charged case goes from one valence into another so sharply that one can almost hear the click as he crosses the valence wall. Of course, one could add to this analogy and say that the theta, which has become N theta at last, begins to form up insulation of its own, but this does not seem very likely. Certain it is, however, that the identification of incidents which are in no way even similar is symptomatic of the insane. The auditor should understand, then, as he confronts his pre-clear, that he may have before him an individual who is incapable of facing any facts in his case. This may be limited to an inability to face facts in certain spheres of his life, such as failing to face facts concerning his wife. He may have such a thoroughly charged second dynamic that he can face no facts concerning his marital existence or his children, but will turn to imaginary facts which are, if untrue, still very safe. The auditor, as has been said before in this book, should not under any circumstances try to slug, bang, hammer, or electric shock his poor pre-clear into admitting that all is imagination. The auditor should be perfectly willing to accept that in certain spheres of the pre-clear's life, the actual facts of the case are so definitely n theta that what theta exists in the pre-clear's mind is unable, by reason of polarity, to encounter the real facts in the case. Almost any human being in some sphere of activity will deal in imaginary incidents up to the level of 3.0. This one, when he faces the idea of school, will detail imaginary incidents simply because his own school experiences contained so much n theta that the theta veers away from it and turns to the imagination to be supplied with facts. Another individual will deal in factual material throughout his field of activity except where religion is concerned. He may have so much n theta on the subject of religion that he veers away from actuality here and talks in terms of atheism or mad dogism, or may go in the other direction and become completely hallucinatory. But in this case, he is veering away from his messed universe to the point where he is constructing an imaginary sphere of activity. The individual who simply turns to the theta universe and perceives there certain visionary things is not necessarily aberrated at all, but may be simply high on theta perceptics. The aberration which is cited above is of the variety of the sadistic zealot, who has been, is, and always will be so much trouble to the Church. Or the imaginary sphere, which I believes to be wholly factual, may be the existence of lost gold mines. Here so much n theta exists with regard to practical and workable means of living that he must deal in imaginary means without realizing the impracticalities of those imaginary means. Or the sphere of delusion may be educational, wherein one has been brought to believe that because one has studied for 12 years and has been given a license, one is capable of aiding his fellow human being. This would not be the product of individual delusion, but of social delusion, based on the cumulative n theta of no knowledge whatsoever of human behavior, but only superstition and authoritarianism and the real and urgent problem that something had to be done with the insane, even if it was only to give them into the hands of sadists and butchers. Somewhere in every case you are going to find the pre-clear running imaginary incidents in lieu of real incidents. As an auditor, you should not worry unless your case is running a majority of imaginary incidents in lieu of real incidents. For your case, then, is running delusion rather than fact by reason of a very low position on the tone scale. Here is a problem for you. You don't dare tell this pre-clear that he is running delusion. This would be a break of the auditor's code. But somehow, you must persuade him to address present time or some locks long enough to free some theta so that he will have a theta ability to face reality. On such a case, you could actually blunder and run physical pain engrams, but you would only interpolate the case further by trapping the existing free theta on the case into the existing n theta, and you would assuredly send the case down the tone scale rather than bring it up. Where the imaginary incident becomes generally preferred to the actual incident, you can be quite sure that you are dealing with a low-tone pre-clear. Now, there are 3 ways of handling this delusion. The first way is to electric shock or prefrontal lobotomize or sedate the pre-clear into utter apathy and uselessness in the society and wreck him completely. This is not recommended. The second way is to scan free or obtain in present time enough free theta to bring the individual up the tone scale to a point where he will run actual incidents rather than imaginary incidents. This is highly valid. The third way is to coax the pre-clear into running avowedly imaginary incidents, and this is the crux of this particular technique of processing. By openly inviting the pre-clear to run imaginary incidents, the auditor is breaking down the barrier of pretense which the pre-clear will unknowingly put up. The running of avowedly imaginary incidents is quite productive. Sometimes the pre-clear will run them, quite astonishingly, with somatics, but he is not being required to face any reality about them, and the auditor is not insisting that any reality exists concerning them. In an astonishingly high percentage of times, however, he will be running actual incidents. So long as he does not have to admit that these incidents are actual, he can do something about them. One might say that the auditor is thus validating the imagination mechanism of the mind, and is strengthening it, and is already beginning to put the general and broad segments of the mind into good working order by differentiating one from another with the pre-clear. Of course, there is always the danger that the auditor's use of the word imagine will restimulate the pre-clear, because this pre-clear may have engrams which tell him that he does not know true from false, and that it is all imagination anyway. But this chance should be taken. It should be understood that no amount of imaginary incidents can supplant the running of real incidents. The first value that this technique has, the invitation to the pre-clear to run avowedly imaginary incidents in his past, is to build up the pre-clear's confidence in the auditor. The pre-clear begins to feel that he will not be censured for indulging in fantasy. In this great, wide, and undoubtedly rational culture, almost any pre-clear has been cut to ribbons as a child for indulging in fantasy. The child lacks data and makes up for this lack with a wild and rugged imagination. The child quite easily sees fairies and strange animals walking about with his imagination. If he finds life dull and elders hard to shock into taking an interest in him, he may recount these things as valid. He is, of course, inevitably censured by the hard-headed, practical, and undoubtedly rational elder, and so accumulates a series of locks on any engrams he may have. Left to himself and to his fantasies and imaginings, the child will eventually, of course, find out what reality is, that grim thing in our world of the 20th century, and what is fantasy. But the elder is apt to press the child into too early a compression by this reality. Actually, of what reality is, neither you nor I have much notion. But we have agreed upon certain facts, and having agreed, we wish to remain friends, and so we continue this agreement. As a culture ages, these agreements are harder and harder to disturb, and are maintained not because they are true, but because they are simple and easy, and because no energy is required to maintain them. The child, fresh and new in the world, would like to see a little excitement in his reality, and the elder, worn and haggard by a combat with an environment which offers little in terms of security and much in terms of menace, fights back against these bright bubbles and dreams. Thus, any pre-clear you have on the couch is fairly certain to have experienced a confusion between what he wanted to think was reality and what he was told he would have to accept as reality. Thus, there was an invalidation of his reality, even though his reality was actually imagination. When the pre-clear on the couch discovers that he has an auditor who not only will listen to imagination, but who encourages it, the affinity level rises, and actually the pre-clear's ability to differentiate in terms of reality will itself rise. In the running of imaginary incidents, the auditor must never, after the incident has been run, then insist that the incident was real. This would be a break of faith. He and the pre-clear have entered into a contract that what is being run is pure imagination, and the auditor must not break this contract. The running of imaginary incidents may consist of running imaginary pleasure moments, which is heightening in terms of theta, or it may consist of running imaginary moments of grief or physical pain, which makes available to the auditor more data on the case and may actually increase the theta on the case. Here is a most interesting fact for the auditor. It may happen with an aberrated child that he has occasionally pretended injury or illness for the sake of accepting sympathy or interest from his parents, guardians, or mentors. The auditor would do well to discover the times in the life of the pre-clear when he has knowingly feigned injury or illness in order to knowingly receive sympathy or interest from those about him. In the first place, when an individual will do this, he is in fairly bad shape, for this is a form of pretended death. The environment wherein the pre-clear would do this must have been a highly restimulative environment which had the pre-clear low on the tone scale. One should realize that in the course of a lifetime, environ to environ, an individual varies markedly on the tone scale. These knowing pretenses are of interest to the auditor because they are invariably real as to their background. The pre-clear may have supposed at the time, in all confidence, that he was lying, but he was actually offering a sympathy engram to those about him, and the auditor can thus discover a highly aberrative engram on the case. Whether this case is in shape to run this engram or not is up to the judgment of the auditor, but he at least knows that it exists. The pre-clear who continually pretended an injury to his foot, for instance, may have supposed that he was lying and may have supposed that he had never had a foot injury. But in actuality, somewhere earlier, hidden from his analytical mind, a foot injury exists for which the pre-clear received a great deal of sympathy. Sympathy incidents are relatively hard to locate. The pre-clear will hold on to an incident in which he received sympathy far, far longer than one where he received only antagonism. The location of the allies of the pre-clear is thus rendered difficult to the auditor, but the mechanism of discovering the imaginary illnesses, which the pre-clear offered to the world around him, discovers the allies. There is another method of discovering allies which is of interest. One finds an antagonistic personality in the pre-clear's life and runs the pre-clear back through incident upon incident where this antagonistic personality was attacking him, until one finds a point where the pre-clear was being defended by someone. The person who does the defending is an ally or pseudo-ally of the pre-clear, and incidents with this person should be followed backwards and forwards and cleaned out of the case as one of the most aberrative elements of the case. For a discussion of allies and pseudo-allies, see the handbook, Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health. A brief definition of these terms may be given here. Ally, a person recorded in one or more of the pre-clear's physical pain engrams who is, because of this recording, believed by the pre-clear to have defended him or promoted his survival. Pseudo-ally, a person about whom the pre-clear has a similar computation, not based directly on an engram recording, but on a similarity to an ally. The imaginary incident serves 4 purposes. First and foremost, it gives the auditor data about his pre-clear, since the imaginary incident which the pre-clear will recount has some basis in actuality. The next point is that the recounting of an imaginary incident heightens the affinity between the pre-clear and the auditor, in that the pre-clear begins to find that the auditor must be somewhat compatible with him, since the auditor will accept the pre-clear's evaluation of existence and thus seems to be in agreement with and similar to the pre-clear. The next value of the imaginary incident is that it increases communication between the pre-clear and the auditor. Here at least we have the pre-clear talking about something and the auditor listening, and the pre-clear discovering that the auditor will listen without interruption or criticism to a recounting which may be quite wild and sensational. The fourth value of the imaginary incident is that it finds the auditor non-insistent upon a high level of fact, and so will find the pre-clear more willing to deliver fact. The imaginary incident could be said to be a testing ground. The auditor asks the pre-clear to run an imaginary incident. This is all right with the pre-clear, since they have agreed that the incident is to be imaginary, and thus the pre-clear cannot be censured for saying anything he pleases. It will happen in the running of imaginary incidents that somatics will turn on, or it will happen that the pre-clear is suffering certain somatics and yet is too low on the tone scale with regard to this particular subject to admit the actual cause of these somatics. By running off imaginary words and phrases, imagining what Papa says, imagining what Mama says, or imagining the year in which this happened, or imagining the circumstances relating to this, it may come about that the somatic disappears. One has actually run off an engram or a heavy lock, and the case is thereby benefited. The auditor does not cavil with the pre-clear about facts in any case. Where the auditor has to use imaginary incidents to get any information of any kind out of the pre-clear, he is dealing with a pre-clear who has been invalidated very thoroughly by the people around him most of his life. The imaginary incident is a mechanism which actually repairs past invalidations. The pre-clear will not admit that an incident is actual because those around the pre-clear have too often challenged his ability to recount actuality or to deliver forth facts. The auditor gets around these past invalidations by himself refusing to invalidate, by inviting an incident purely on the basis of imagination. The pre-clear is heartened. The auditor will receive data, and free theta may be liberated in the case. The pre-clear and auditor as a group. It must be noted somewhere in this work, and may be noted here since the running of imaginary incidents is most productive of the result, that the pre-clear and the auditor form, actually, a group. One need not know the high level of technology, which is group Dianetics, to understand that two human beings make a group. Two is the basic unit not only of theta, but of human beings in group terms. The group may number millions at its largest, but in its basic size, it is at least two. Occasionally, the pre-clear will discover in the auditor an antagonistic personality. This comes about when the auditor reminds the pre-clear of some personality earlier in the pre-clear's life who did something non-survival to the pre-clear. The auditor who permits himself to go on in this imaginary role of a past antagonist will find that his task is greatly increased. It is of very great value to the auditor to clear himself and the pre-clear as a group before he begins any serious auditing. In the optimum group, a high level of affinity, reality, and communication must exist. Between the auditor and the pre-clear, ARC must be high. There are various ways to clear groups. The auditor should not be as anxious to approve of the pre-clear as he should be to have the pre-clear approve of his auditor. Nevertheless, it will take considerable strain off the case and the processing if this works both ways. One auditor, in order to clear the group, himself and the pre-clear, habitually requests the pre-clear to tell him what the pre-clear does not like about him. The pre-clear, at first, through propitiation or social usage, will not admit that there is anything about the auditor which he does not like. But on pressing the case, this auditor very shortly discovers for the pre-clear antipathetic individuals in the pre-clear's past of whom the auditor reminds the pre-clear. The first act of the auditor, then, is by straight memory to clear up these bad associations. The establishment of affinity, communication, and reality between the pre-clear and the auditor is of vital concern if processing is to follow anywhere near an optimum course. Where a co-auditing team is being formed, and the success of Dianetics is built upon co-auditing teams, a mutual clearance is required, whereby each unburdens himself to the other, and, by straight memory, undesirable associations are cleared out of the relationship. It is remarkable that between any two human beings, bad associations by reason of past existing personalities are almost inevitable. Individuals on the normal level of this social culture associate hidden past personalities with present personalities they meet. Straightwire can easily clear up this situation. The auditor mentioned above was having some difficulty with a woman pre-clear, until he discovered that the way he cleared his throat reminded her of the first of her husbands, of which she had had 3. The point here is that the auditor did not forego his habit of clearing his throat merely because the pre-clear objected to it. The auditor immediately went to work and caused her, by making her remember, to conceive a difference between himself and her first husband. The moment she did this, the auditor's habit of clearing his throat was no longer of any importance, and he could go on clearing his throat. The auditor should not change his habits and training pattern to match every pre-clear, but should use the effect of these upon the pre-clear to locate past antipathetic personalities. This in itself frees theta in the case. The use of imaginary incidents acts to form a smoother relationship between the auditor and the pre-clear by establishing for the pre-clear the auditor's willingness to accept anything the pre-clear has to say. But it does more than this. It gives the auditor a valuable assessment of the pre-clear's position on the tone scale, for he can judge this rather easily by the type of incident which the pre-clear likes to imagine, see pleasure moments, and it tells the auditor what may be in highest restimulation in the present time environment. The auditor who will scorn imagination or condemn anything the pre-clear says as delusion, regardless of the auditor's inability to compare it with his own concept of reality, will inevitably bring about the destruction of the auditor-pre-clear group, and they will not be able to work together. The husband-wife team has been found in Dianetics to be the least compatible group, a commentary upon American marriage, the training of the male to accept marriage as part of his environment, and the lack of training of the female in how to be a wife. A few husband-wife teams are successful, but the majority are not, and husbands and wives should look outside the home for co-auditors, or the marriage may collapse. Chapter 10, Column AF, Locks. Elsewhere we have the anatomy of entheta. Entheta could be said to be in 4 forms. There are probably more than that. By entheta we mean, of course, enturbulated theta. The first form is that which is the basic cause of entheta, the engram. Here, theta, in its effort to conquer mest, has come into too heavy a collision with mest. In an organism, this causes physical pain. Theta, after it has become inturbulated with mest, can, either by the mechanism of death or by dianetic processing, be withdrawn from the mest and brings with it an intelligence of the laws of mest, which it can then use in a further conquest of mest on a more orderly and harmonious level. All things begin with a heavy impact and in turbulence, if anything is to be learned by theta about mest. The Foundation, for instance, in its first year of existence, smashed heavily into mest, and if this delighted those who desired to preserve the status quo, or those who had no use for an end of aberration, yet much was learned so that group dianetics could come into being, and so that improvements could come about as a result of new data on the third dynamic, which in turn resulted in improvements along the first dynamic and in the techniques of individual processing. The engram is a moment of physical pain and unconsciousness which is recorded in the reactive mind with all perceptions during the period of unconsciousness. It can be keyed in by conscious-level experiences, it can be dramatized, and it can manifest itself either as mental aberration or as physical aberrations, which were called in the past psychosomatic illnesses. The engram consists of n-mest, which is the mest of the organism inturbulated or disordered by impact, and n-theta, which is mingled with the n-mest. N-theta can exist as temporary turbulence in the individual's life force or reason when he is confronted by unreasonable or non-survival circumstances in his environment. This could be called temporarily enturbulated theta. However, in any situation in present time which is restimulative, a certain amount of n-theta becomes fixedly n-theta and is stored in the reactive mind. And thereafter, save in those extraordinary circumstances wherein enormous quantities of free theta are in the environment of the individual, or but for dianetic processing, this fixed n-theta remains fixed. The permanently fixed n-theta remains in the reactive mind in the form of secondary engrams or in the form of locks. The secondary engram will be described in its own turn, but is a low tone level experience of loss, or fear of loss, or anger because of threatened loss, or apathy because of accomplished loss. The lock has 3 variations. One of them is where the individual has been prevented from carrying out the commands of the engram, which is restimulated by present-time environmental perceptics, broken dramatization. Another is merely where the perceptics of the engram are approximated by those of the present-time environment, restimulation. The third is caused by inhibitions and enforcements of ARC. In order for a lock to be formed, it is necessary for the analytical portion of the person's mind to be somewhat lowered in activity or alertness. Locks can be received only when an individual is weary, upset by reverses, or is in a generally non-optimum situation. These light approximations of engrams in the analytical present-time environment pass for aberrative in themselves. Actually, they are not. The lock is only the surface manifestation of the total environmental cause of aberration. Underlying any lock must be an engram. A lock occurs also when the individual is attempting to carry out the however irrational commands of the engram and is prevented by the society's or some individual's counter-reason from accomplishing the dramatization. Locks are analytical-level insistments of n-theta. The average case probably has several thousand engrams. Individuals are often questioned on the subject of how often they have been unconscious. A few of them will answer that they have never been unconscious in their whole life. As soon as they are sent back down the track, they begin to discover period after period when they have been injured or operated upon. And certainly every individual has been born, and birth, above all other experiences, is sufficiently arduous to bring about unconsciousness. Since the reactive mind registers upon a cellular level and also upon a theta body level, if evidently to a lesser extent, the earliest moment when an engram can be received is certainly no later than conception. Engrams do not begin to receive locks ordinarily until well after birth, and usually well into the speech period, although babies will react to the uncomprehended sounds in the environment which are also included in their engrams. A lock is, then, a relatively light incident, which betokens a restimulation of some engram on the case. There are, in any case, tens of thousands of locks. If one continued to address locks and only locks in a case, processing would be almost interminable. This is fortunately unnecessary. Locks have only to be addressed in a case until the pre-clear has run out engrams. The locks consequent to any one engram or chain of engrams which he has run out can be scanned off with great speed. Locks are interesting to the auditor mainly on the low-tone cases. On many cases, the auditor will discover that locks have to be run as engrams. He will find a period where some pre-clear has, as a young girl, been forced to eat spinach, and this will seem to be a highly aberrative incident. The pre-clear, if very low on the tone scale, may be responding to the action phrases or commands in the lock. Yet this incident contains no physical pain of any kind, and still, once sent to the incident, the pre-clear is unable to leave it until it is run complete with action phrases. This would betoken a very low-tone pre-clear. The auditor should not think that the reason his pre-clear is aberrated is because she was made to eat spinach when she was 8 years old. The auditor should understand that underlying this incident is an engram or many engrams whereby the pre-clear is dominated. But if the auditor discovers that the lock is in itself aberrative, he should understand that this is no time to run engrams, since this pre-clear must be unburdened of many locks and minor engrams before she will be in shape to run engrams. Here is a very heavily charged case. As one can read in the column on the tone scale chart, a clear has all locks discharged. This is sometimes overlooked by the ambitious auditor. A clear is, by definition, one who has had all and theta in his current life converted to theta. This means that his engrams must have been erased, that his secondaries must have been discharged, and that his locks must have been scanned out. The 3.5 will blow locks almost as fast as the engrams underlying chains of locks are reduced. The 3.0 does not have to have locks addressed as individual incidents, but in order to clear up the case, scanning of locks is necessary, as will be seen in the next column. The 2.5 can have locks treated with benefit as individual incidents. It will be found that moments when the 2.5 was criticized for stepping out of line at school or for being mean to sister will release some N theta. However, the auditor is to some degree wasting his time by treating, at this level of the tone scale, non-physical pain and non-misemotion incidents as individual occurrences. Around 2.0, locks begin to become important. The auditor can go into a moment in the pre-clear's past life when the pre-clear was consciously alert and had something happen to him which was productive of N theta and yet discover that the incident will not reduce. This non-reduction of relatively simple incidents as it proceeds from 2.0 on down on the tone scale indicates a considerably charged case. Minimal physical discomfort in an incident, if the restimulative agents in the environment are high, can produce moments when the pre-clear was alert and awake which then refuse to reduce when addressed by the auditor. The 1.5 is peculiarly susceptible to the type of lock which breaks the dramatization. Let us say that the 1.5 is being angry against something and someone criticizes him for being angry or prevents him from carrying out the full cycle of his anger. A lock results which will be remarkably effective in reducing this person on the tone scale. Of course, any 1.5 receives a nearly countless number of such incidents, since the society generally frowns upon people being angry and would rather have them apathetic. On a 1.5, an auditor can run these broken dramatizations with benefit as individual incidents, just as though they were engrams. At 1.1, we begin to find locks extremely effective, particularly when they concern breaks of affinity, breaks of communication, and breaks of reality or enforcements of ARC. The 1.1 lives in fear most of the time, fear of something, if only as a nebulous anxiety. The remark of a 1.1's friend, which leads the 1.1 to believe that he will not immediately see his friend again, may produce a lock, even though the 1.1 that very evening may dine with his friend. Here the N theta is beginning to pile up at a very rapid rate. The auditor can run such incidents just as though they were engrams with some benefit to the case. At 0.5, we begin to discover that locks must be handled gingerly. For locks in a 0.5 can be heavy enough to cause the pre-clear to hang up on the track, except, of course, in the wide-open case, which runs on the track even when completely insane. In the apathy case, the loss of a glove or the mere receipt of a letter, even though it is good news, can cause a lock which has to be run as an engram by the auditor. A heavy lock where something really happens would be much too strong in N theta for the pre-clear to attack, and the auditor should avoid incidents which would be productive of aberration at the 1.5 or even the 1.1 level. The 0.5 can be aberrated by a sneeze. The 0.1, if the auditor can contact this individual, is so low in theta that incidents which would be pleasure moments to anyone else are the strongest and heaviest insistments which can be attacked. The only past moment which can be attacked in a 0.1 is an instance of the mildest variety, such as going for a ride in a car or eating supper. Any incident of mental stress is to be avoided, and any incident of physical stress is, of course, entirely out of the question, as it has been from 1.1 down the tone scale. Chapter 11, Column AG, Scanning Locks. The advent of lock scanning was the greatest single advance in techniques of application in Dianetics in the last 6 months of 1950. Lock scanning was developed in an effort to convert the maximum amount of N theta into theta in the least possible time. It is a remarkable technique. It was discovered that individuals who were thoroughly stuck on the time track and heavily overcharged could send a few attention units earlier and later than the point where they were stuck, and could, in such a fashion, actually emerge from a chronically fixed spot on the time track and so come to present time. The value of lock scanning can hardly be overestimated. The heavily occluded case can be lock scanned. Auditing, bad and good, can be removed from a case by lock scanning. Invalidations of Dianetics, which reduce the pre-clear's ability to be processed, can be removed from the case. ARC locks in enormous quantity can be de-intensified. It is a technique with which the pre-clear can be moved swiftly up the tone scale. Lock scanning can produce sufficient change in a case to move the case 2 points on the scale in a single session. A case which has been audited inexpertly can be set to rights and boosted up the tone scale by lock scanning. Some cases on which many engrams have been run may yet not have risen on the tone scale because the N theta of the processing interpolated present time and created new locks. Lock scanning remedies this. Some cases which have been book audited remain relatively static on the tone scale, but with 2 to 4 hours of lock scanning rebound swiftly and attain a new level of activity. The technique of lock scanning is a very simple one. All aberrative incidents are in types, in series of a similar nature. All affinity breaks by a certain person on a case could be considered a chain. All affinity breaks by anyone in any environment at any time could be considered a very broad consecutive chain in the pre-clear's life. All affinity enforcements by a single person on the pre-clear could be considered a brief chain, and all affinity enforcements by all people could be considered a broad chain. Communication, talking, listening, seeing, not seeing, and all other perceptics enforced and inhibited make up their own chains. Reality enforcements and inhibitions make up their own chains of agreements and disagreements. The auditor can actually draw up a chart on which all possible chains of locks can be shown in terms of affinity, reality, communication, and broken dramatizations. Engrams also exist in chains, as will be covered later. The engram, or chain of engrams, provides the basic upon which locks can be accumulated. Hundreds and hundreds of incidents may be derived from an engram or chain of engrams. To run each one of these incidents as itself would require far too much time on the part of the auditor. But the pre-clear can readily be brought by the auditor to scan, slowly or rapidly, similar types of incidents from the earliest to the latest, either with regard to one person or with regard to all persons or with regard to a period of time. The commands necessary to permit the pre-clear to lock scan are very simple. These can be made far more complex, since speeds of scanning can be demanded of the pre-clear. It is discovered, however, that the pre-clear will normally scan at his own speed. The auditor asks the file clerk if there is a type of incident which can be scanned in the case. The file clerk, at a snap of the auditor's finger, answers yes or no. The auditor requests the name of the type of incident. The file clerk gives the name of the type of incident. The auditor then tells the pre-clear to go to the earliest available moment on this chain of locks, and again asks the file clerk a question as to whether or not this chain can be scanned without running through any engrams. Assured that it can be, and only if assured that it can be, the auditor tells the pre-clear to scan from this earliest moment to present time through all incidents of the type named. The auditor makes a drill of this and never varies his procedure. He sends the pre-clear back to his starting line, the earliest available lock of this type. He makes certain the pre-clear is there by asking, "Are you there?" When the pre-clear assents, the auditor then says, "Through this chain of incidents, avoiding all physical pain, begin scanning." The final command telling the pre-clear to begin scanning is like the starter's gun. Slowly or rapidly, the pre-clear goes up through these various similar incidents. These incidents may consist of all the times when anybody stopped or interrupted him when he wanted to talk, or they may consist of the times that a certain person, such as the pre-clear's mother or wife, demanded affection. But whatever the type of incident, the auditor must adopt a routine and not vary this routine. The auditor should always tell the pre-clear when to begin scanning. The pre-clear should not be encouraged to go to the earliest moment he can discover and then start forward without any further signal. The pre-clear should report to the auditor when he has reached the earliest available moment, if he is able to know this, and the auditor should instruct the pre-clear to report when he arrives at present time so that no time will be wasted. Scanning can be done either vocally or non-vocally. The pre-clear can give the auditor, each time he touches a new incident, the most aberrative phrase of that incident. This would be vocal scanning. Or the pre-clear can simply go through the incidents recognizing each one as he passes it, or racing through them so fast that they are merely a blur without telling the auditor what he is contacting. It will be discovered that the pre-clear ordinarily finds the most recent locks in his case the first which can be scanned. As he begins to scan chains of locks off his case, he will begin to find earlier and earlier chains of locks and portions of chains which he can scan. He should be encouraged to discover earlier and earlier moments in his life. Anytime a pre-clear starts to scan a chain of locks, he can be expected on the second or third time through to find earlier incidents of the same type which he previously missed. This is symptomatic of more and more theta being available to the case, so that earlier and earlier moments can be reached. The auditor should not bully the pre-clear, however. If the pre-clear cannot discover an earlier incident after the auditor has requested one, the auditor should not be insistent. Any chain is scanned many times. It will be discovered that at first there are only 1 or 2 incidents on the chain. Further scanning brings forward 5 or 10 incidents on the chain. Then the old incidents begin to drop out as unimportant, and new incidents, hitherto unrecalled, begin to appear. The chain is ordinarily short during the first scan. Then it appears to lengthen, and finally the pre-clear either becomes interested in his outside environment or in another chain, or the chain becomes so short that it takes him only a moment to scan through many years of his life. The mechanism of scanning is this. One contacts an incident and recognizes it as a concept of an incident. Perhaps one has a phrase in the first incident. The auditor may ask the pre-clear to repeat that phrase or not, as the auditor desires. The pre-clear then goes forward from this incident to the next one of a similar type that he can recognize. The mind is intensely selective of types of incidents it can scan. It seems that there is a filing system in the mind which files according to types of topic. This is what is used in lock scanning. If one wishes to be precise about lock scanning, there is vocal rate, in which the pre-clear scans, pausing at each new lock up the chain only long enough to give the most aberrative phrase out of it. There is non-vocal scanning, in which the pre-clear recognizes the phrases as he goes by them, incident to incident from early to late, but does not tell the auditor what phrases he is contacting. There is accelerated rate, which is merely a rapid glance at the incident before the pre-clear goes on to the next, and in which the auditor is not told what the individual incidents are. And then there is maximum speed. Maximum speed can be so fast that the incidents are simply a blur. The pre-clear has no analytical recognition of what is happening beyond differences of position, flashes of faces, and flashes of words. Lock scanning frees theta from innumerable incidents and is highly instrumental in raising the tone of the pre-clear. It should not be confused with the chain scanning of engrams. Chain scanning through moments of physical pain is not desirable in cases below 3.5 on the tone scale, since the engrams, by their physical pain, will snatch more free theta back into turbulence than will be freed. Theoretically, a case can be lock scanned to a point where practically no aberration is manifested. But this is only theoretical, since only one of 4 types of N-theta is being converted. The 4 types, of course, are N-theta received because of the present time environment, N-theta insisted in the form of locks, N-theta existing as charge in engrams, and N-theta existing as engrams themselves. The type of N-theta which exists as charge in locks and in secondaries freeze from late to early. Engrams run from early to late. Thus, one begins lock scanning very late in the case. One may find it necessary to scan out a marriage or a business relationship which exists near to present time before one can continue with anything else in the case. It does not much matter to the auditor whether or not the pre-clear is in valence inside himself when he scans through these chains of locks. Lock scanning is a broad, sloppy technique. The pre-clear can be out of valence, he can scan imaginary incidents, he can scan concepts, he can scan even his own conclusions about life. He can scan anything from which N-theta can be freed. In order to get rid of the N-theta on an education, there is nothing that compares with lock scanning. One can also do this trick with lock scanning. He can refresh an education. An individual can be given an examination in, let us say, history, 8th grade. He can then be lock scanned through the actual study of history in the 8th grade and given another examination. It will ordinarily be found that he will receive a higher grade after he has been lock scanned through that educational period. And yet the lock scanning may not have required more than 15 or 20 minutes. In this wise, lock scanning is an excellent trick for those about to take an examination on academic subjects. People can lock scan themselves with considerable ease unless they are too low on the tone scale. They merely start at the earliest incident they can remember of a certain kind which may be troubling them, and come forward through all similar incidents to present time. They do this over and over until they become interested in their present time environment. The time to stop lock scanning of any particular chain of locks is when the pre-clear is extroverted, which is to say, interested in his present time environment, or when the chain requires only an instant or two to scan. It can happen that a pre-clear is scanned through a chain of locks beyond the point when scanning this particular chain of locks should be stopped. The auditor will then find himself with a pre-clear who is running another set of locks. There is nothing particularly bad in this, but the auditor has lost control of the case for a moment. The auditor should then be alert as to how long it takes the pre-clear to scan each chain, and as to how the pre-clear feels each time he finishes scanning the chain, and he should ask questions about these points. Lock scanning is a highly unrestimulative type of technique to the auditor. The pre-clear, unless he is running at vocal rate, is not uttering restimulative phrases, and he can go from early to late and pass through the most amazing array of incidents without the auditor being aware of what is going on. Therefore, the auditor does not become restimulated. It happens that an auditor running locks in chains on a pre-clear can, however, become somewhat bored. He should not, no matter how much he would like to relieve his tedium, interrupt the pre-clear in any way until the pre-clear has finished scanning the chain. Each time, the auditor should let the pre-clear sweep forward to present time. As in any other case, the auditor should always check the pre-clear to find out if he is in present time at the end of each scan, unless the pre-clear is scanning a period of time which does not include present time. One can scan locks in terms of time, let us say from the 5th to the 10th year of the pre-clear's life, or from the 20th to the 25th year, or from the 30th to the 41st year. Or he can scan between specific dates, or scanning can be done on one person on one subject, or scanning can be done on one type of activity, or scanning can be done on education or early training, or scanning can be done on the immediate environment of the pre-clear. Lock scanning of auditing is a highly valuable procedure. The auditor in every session, if his pre-clear can scan at all, should scan off all of the auditing. This is to say, send the pre-clear back to the moment when the session began and have him scan forward to present time. It does not then much matter how many engrams the pre-clear has restimulated or what has happened during the session. The pre-clear by scanning can destimulate the incidents which rise. The failure to reduce an engram was much more serious in the past than it is at this time. Lock scanning makes it possible to run the session in which the engram was restimulated. Of course, the restimulation of an engram without reducing it is merely the creation of a new lock. Lock scanning reduces this new lock. The auditor should never be critical of how carelessly the pre-clear might be scanning. Lock scanning is broad enough to include such proclivities. Looking over the tone scale, one discovers first that any 3.5, when he has had his engrams run out in their entirety, has to be lock scanned through all activities of life in order to qualify as a clear. This frees up all locks. Locks, of course, at this level of the tone scale are very easy to free, since they have few engrams underlying them. In the near clear, they have no engrams underlying them, but locks can still exist on a case which has been cleared of engrams. Although these locks may work out in the next many months after the last engram is run, it is far easier to sit down to a systematic scanning of all the persons and circumstances of the pre-clear's past life. The 3.0 can be lock scanned with great profit and will scan through locks without hanging up in any of them. In this way, new series of engrams can be bared to view. The only reason engrams cannot be run is because too many locks exist on top of them, and lock scanning is the best method of getting off this end theta in order to make the engram itself available. The 2.5 has to be lock scanned in order to get engrams to show up clearly. After lock scanning has taken place, an engram can be expected to come into view with all of the necessary perceptics. Lock scanning tunes up the 2.5 to a point where engrams can be cleanly run. In order to discover new engrams in the 2.5, new chains of locks should be scanned. The 2.0 can be lock scanned, but the auditor should work with chains of locks given by the file clerk. Every chain which is contacted by the auditor on the 2.0 should be reduced just as one would reduce engrams that were contacted. No chain should be left in restimulation at this level, but should be run completely. If the session is too short for this, scanning of the session will probably cause the restimulation to fade out. From 2.0 on down, lock scanning begins to develop a brief liability, but not a lessened workability. The pre-clear is apt, after he scans a certain chain of locks a few times, to hang up in one of the locks or to hang up in some minor secondary. It is then necessary to run whatever incident the pre-clear finds himself hung up in as an engram in itself, although it may contain no physical pain. The 1.5 will, as a common result of lock scanning, hang up in a lock. The auditor starts scanning locks and, after a short time, finds that the 1.5 is not moving on the track. He should always admonish the 1.5 to inform him when he stops on the track or when he appears to cease moving on the track. Otherwise, the 1.5 is likely to flounder around and wonder why he is not going forward to present time and not say anything about it, and so many minutes of auditing are wasted until the auditor recognizes that something is wrong and does something about it. If the 1.5 hangs up in a lock and the auditor, by running this lock as an engram, cannot reduce it, then it is only necessary to start the 1.5 scanning another set of locks, gotten from the file clerk, of course. By scanning the new set, he drops out of the engram or lock in which he was stuck. This is the peculiar virtue of lock scanning. If one cannot reduce the engram or secondary or lock in which the pre-clear may hang up, it is only necessary to cause the pre-clear to scan a new chain of locks in order to release the pre-clear on the track. This is a mechanism which must be stressed, for it is very important. Whenever a pre-clear hangs up in a lock, and by running the lock just as though it were an engram, the auditor finds that it will not immediately reduce. All the auditor need do is consult the file clerk to discover another chain of locks which the pre-clear can scan, or to discover an earlier incident of the same type in which the pre-clear is locked up. Scanning the new set of incidents or contacting the earlier incident by straight memory will cause the pre-clear to become free on the track. Below 1.5, a new mechanism is introduced into lock scanning. Actually, this is a combination mechanism. At 1.1, or for that matter from 2.0 down, lock scanning can be combined with straight memory. By straight memory, a certain type of incident which is found to be aberrative in the pre-clear may be contacted. When this type of incident is contacted, the auditor need not necessarily leave it at that. but may direct the pre-clear to go back to that incident which was discovered and scan through all similar incidents. Very shortly, earlier incidents of the same type will show up, and so an enormous number of such incidents can be taken off the case. Lock scanning can actually be called a high-speed straight wire rather than anything else. Straight memory combined with lock scanning can isolate certain circuit commands or domination commands or control yourself commands which would remain hidden under ordinary lock scanning procedures. The 1.1 can be expected to hang up in some lock after the auditor has started him scanning. The auditor then scans locks on the 1.1 in the full expectation that he will shortly find the 1.1 not moving on the track. Indeed, that 1.1, unless a wide-open case, will commonly or chronically be stuck on the track, as will also be a 1.5. Lock scanning brings into view, however, heavier locks, and theta is converted to theta until the heavier lock will show up. The heavier lock, of course, was no less effective when hidden. Lock scanning bears it to view. The auditor then runs this new incident in which the pre-clear has stuck in order to free him, or failing to free him, finds another chain which can be scanned in order to free him. The scanning of a new chain to free the pre-clear from a point on the track where he is stuck can be overcomplicated by the auditor. Actually, it is only necessary to direct the pre-clear's attention to a new subject or to ask his file clerk for a new subject. The pre-clear might get so thoroughly involved with the lock in which he sticks that it would not occur to him that he could scan any other subject at the moment. It is up to the auditor to realize this and to direct the pre-clear's attention to another type of incident. Scanning the new type of incident, the pre-clear may free up from the incident in which he was stuck, but hang up in a new lock. The auditor tries to reduce this lock as though it were an engram, and failing that, he goes on to a third type of chain. The 0.5 cannot be lock scanned with profit, since the 0.5 will inevitably hang up too thoroughly. But if the auditor does make the mistake of scanning a 0.5 through locks, he must remember that it is only necessary to scan a new type of lock in order to free the 0.5, or to use straight memory. The 0.1 should never be scanned through any locks. One of the ways of freeing an individual who is being lock scanned out of an engram or lock in which he has suddenly hung up is to give him straight memory. Straight memory acts as stilts by which he can be brought up again to present time. The scanning of locks can be combined with the running of single locks and with straight memory with great facility. An individual who is stuck somewhere on the time track can be given straight memory or new chains of locks to scan. The scanning of pleasure moments should not be overlooked as a valid technique for raising the tone of a pre-clear. When a pre-clear is particularly low at the beginning of a session, or at the end of one if the auditor has made some mistake, it is necessary to raise his tone. Scanning of pleasure moments will very often permit enough free theta to come into existence, either to make new incidents available or to successfully end the session. It should be admonished again that when one scans locks, he should work as closely as possible with the file clerk, consulting the file clerk as to what chain of locks should next be scanned on the case, and then following as nearly as possible the file clerk's directions. In the absence of file clerk directions, the auditor should use his own judgment or talk the subject over with the pre-clear. It will very often happen in the process of lock scanning that the pre-clear goes into a boil-off. It should be remembered that boil-offs are highly beneficial and should not be interrupted for any cause whatsoever. When the pre-clear comes out of the boil-off, the auditor should ask him for the phrase which put him into the boil-off, and should ask the pre-clear to repeat that phrase again. The pre-clear, repeating this phrase out loud or to himself several times, will ordinarily then go back into the boil-off. Boil-offs should be exhausted completely. They are a condition of somnolence which is sometimes indistinguishable from sleep, and a pre-clear should not be disturbed while he is in one. The removal of boil-off from a case is the removal of accumulated anitin and is highly beneficial. Some cases can do nothing but boil-off. The individual can lock scan himself if he keeps in mind the fact that when he hangs up in a lock somewhere out of present time, he must nudge himself into scanning another type of lock rather than trying to fuddle through the place where he is stuck. It will also happen that the pre-clear will run into grief charges as a result of scanning locks. It may be that he gets grief on a single phrase. He may not know from what incident this phrase comes. If he is fairly low on the tone scale, he may have no conception whatsoever of what he is crying about. But the release of grief in any event is beneficial. It may occur that the only way the auditor can get grief off a case is by scanning certain chains of locks and then getting grief off a single phrase. An individual who has a chronically restimulated somatic which is giving him sinus trouble or a headache can be scanned out of it without any recognition of what was the source in engrammic terms of the headache or other malcondition. In such an instance, it is mainly beneficial to scan pleasure moments. This will almost always raise the pre-clear's tone. The value of lock scanning, it may be repeated, is difficult to overestimate. The auditor will do a great deal of it on any case. Any case, except the 0.5 and the 0.1, will benefit from lock scanning. The auditor may make the serious mistake of believing that because the engram is the basic cause of aberration, it is therefore the only thing or the main thing that he should contact. He should disabuse himself of this idea. With the high-speed technique of lock scanning, he can bring a case up to the point where running engrams will permit the case to proceed to clear. Without taking this charge off the case, he could run engrams for 1,000 years and not bring his pre-clear up to clear. The auditor should use straight memory and lock scanning and the running of secondaries until the case has enough theta to run engrams. It is possible to run actual engrams on a low-toned pre-clear session after session without raising his tone. This is because the running of engrams on such a case lays in auditing locks. The theta which is freed from the engram is immediately reinturbulated, and the pre-clear's tone remains the same or sinks because of the inturbulation of more and more free theta in numerous auditing locks. Such a case should be lock scanned. The auditor should develop his technique of lock scanning and should be very patient in his use of it. He will find himself at times sitting for 20 or 30 minutes while the pre-clear scans one chain. The auditor should be content to sit there and let the pre-clear scan until it becomes apparent to him that the pre-clear is not moving on the track or is in some difficulty. He should have a complete understanding with the pre-clear about what they are doing. The pre-clear should understand that the auditor, working with the pre-clear's file clerk, is the one who selects the chains of locks to be scanned. The pre-clear should understand that it is the auditor who starts him scanning and that the auditor is still in control of the case. By lock scanning, the auditor will get the maximum amount of N theta on the case converted back to free theta where it belongs. Chapter 12. Column AH. Secondary engrams. Probably the majority of N theta which accumulates in an individual becomes tied up in secondary engrams. A secondary engram can be defined as a period of anguish brought about by a major loss or a threat of loss to the individual. The secondary engram depends for its strength and force upon physical pain engrams which underlie it. Without a physical pain engram, it is apparently impossible for a secondary engram to be formed. The type of N theta which becomes trapped in a secondary engram is evidently a heavy reverse of polarity of theta. Emotion becomes misemotion. Affinity, reality, and communication components of theta, by the loss or threat of loss to the individual, convert and thereafter repel the affinity, reality, and communication components which yet remain in a state of theta. An engram is a moment of physical pain, such as an anesthetic operation, an accident, an illness, or any condition producing unconsciousness. An engram can occur, however, and remain inactive. No engram is active until it is keyed in, which is to say until a moment when the environment around the awake individual is itself similar to the dormant engram. At that moment, the engram becomes active. It is keyed in and can thereafter be dramatized. It will affect, by virtue of its commands, the processes of thought of the individual, creating obsessions, compulsions, neuroses, and psychoses below his conscious level. Or the physical pain component can create psychosomatic illnesses, which are in Dianetics more accurately called the chronic somatics of engrams. Physical pain engrams can exist in large numbers on a case without being keyed in and without being active. The key-in may be only a lock. The key-in and additional locks begin to give the engram more and more n-theta, and it becomes more and more powerful in its effect upon the individual. It has to be, in short, charged up in order to affect the individual. The heaviest and most abrupt charge which an engram can receive is a secondary engram. The physical pain in the physical pain engram makes it possible for large amounts of theta to be trapped when that theta is interpolated by a present-time shock, such as the loss or threatened loss of survival factors in the person's life. If the physical pain engram were not there to entrap the temporarily interpolated theta, the theta apparently would simply uninterpolate and the individual would return to a fully rational state. With the physical engram present, which has some approximation of the loss or threatened loss, when a severe shock of loss or threatened loss occurs, the turbulence of the individual is apparently to a large degree trapped, and a heavy charge enters the physical pain engram and remains there until Dianetic processing removes it, or until the theta and mest of the individual are separated by death. The theta body has been discovered to contain amounts of n-theta as secondary engrams, but the charges are not as heavy as those of the current life, according to observation. A physical pain engram, once it has charged up with secondary engrams, becomes inaccessible to the analyzer to such an extent that the individual trying to address this engram or series of engrams cannot, with the free theta available to him, penetrate the core of the physical pain. Hallucinatory impressions of the engram may occur. The engram may be run almost as a dream sequence. The somatics are light or non-existent. Content is markedly altered. The position of the engram on the time track may be seriously occluded. In short, the existence of secondary engrams above primary engrams makes it impossible for an individual to run physical pain off of his case. A few minor secondary engrams on a case may only cut off the sharpness of the perceptics, but the usual case has many heavy secondary engrams on it. The seriously occluded case is occluded because of the existence of secondary engrams. The demarcation line between theta and n-theta is 2.0 on the tone scale. The present-time environment of the individual varies on the tone scale, just as the individual from period to period in his life may vary, although in the absence of processing, the individual's course is a gradual decline. One could take any environment and judge its position on the tone scale. In other words, the individual can be located on the tone scale for his chronic position or for a momentary position. A group can be located on the tone scale for its chronic or temporary state, and the present-time environment can be located on the tone scale. Today, one's environment might be happy. This environment would assist one's tone, pulling one slightly up the tone scale. Or when the environment is very happy, it has the occasional result of making the individual's activities and conduct momentarily those of a clear, even if he is ordinarily considerably aberrated. But where a clear would have a resilience and would respond only partially to a present-time environment, a thoroughly aberrated person is almost a slave to the environment. And the lower the individual is on the tone scale, the more seriously he is affected by low-tone environments. Thus, the 1.1 might act like a 2.0 in a very happy and secure environment, but in an even slightly interpolated environment, the 1.1 might act momentarily like a 0.8. Good news, sudden successes, the envisionment or attainment of new components of survival make for a pleasant and happy environment. This would be an environment above 2.0 on the tone scale, the tone of the environment rising in direct ratio to the potentiality of the environment for the survival of those in it. When an idea, a datum, a circumstance, a person, or the general environment is conducive to the survival of the person in question, it can be said to be on a tone scale level above 2.0. Environmental circumstances which lie below 2.0 on the tone scale are n-theta circumstances and are interpolative to the individual. Ideas, news, associations, persons, or the general environment in the band from anger down to pretended death restimulate the individual's existing end theta and interbulate more of the free theta of the individual, and so bring about a reduction of the individual on the tone scale. These are non-survival factors, factors which tend toward the death of the individual or the group, even though the tendency may not be in terms of actual death. It should also be recognized in viewing this and in understanding secondary engrams that when one looks at the tone scale, one is looking at both pitch and volume. In music, a note may be anywhere on the musical scale and yet not be loud. This would be a note of a certain pitch but small volume. A note can be of a certain pitch with a great deal of volume. Further, the note by harmonics and overtones may have quality. It is much the same on the tone scale of human reaction and behavior. The position on the tone scale of a momentary circumstance or of a chronic state tells us only the pitch of the individual's or the group's or the environment's tone. Volume is the second factor which must be studied in considering the tone scale. An individual may be bored, but not, as the saying is, to a degree. He is bored only a minor amount. He may at another time be bored a major amount. In the lower tones, he may be afraid, but only slightly afraid, or he may be so greatly afraid that the fear is terror. The amount or volume of interbulance might be read in a third dimension, extending from the face of the chart out toward its peruser. There might be a little bit of grief or a great deal of grief, but the position on the tone scale would be the same. There is also the matter of quality of interbulance. The quality of the fear or the anger or the quality of the happiness is important, but this would be a factor which would be different from pitch or volume on the tone scale. The amount of free theta with which an individual is endowed is enormously important. The amount of free theta has a great deal to do with the persistence or reasoning force of the individual along any course. This would be the volume of a person. The quality of a person would be more a structural thing. To make this clearer, a person may have an enormous volume of endowed theta and yet not have the structure with which to be intelligent. Or he may have a quality index which is very high and yet not have sufficient endowment of theta to execute the plans which he can conceive. We have all known the individual who received A's in every course, and yet who was never able to do anything with his education. And we have known the individual who received nothing in the way of grades, and who indeed never seemed even to comprehend elementary subjects, and yet who by power of personality forged ahead to a high position in life. A study of this matter gives a useful evaluation of human potentiality and behavior. More importantly, it gives some understanding of what happens to the individual in the process of becoming aberrated. Aberration, considered as pitch or tone, is theoretically independent of quality, structure probably, and volume, theta endowment. The factors of quality and volume would account in part for the individual differences which may be found in aberrated persons at similar levels of the tone scale. The analogy with music should not be overworked, of course, since a low tone in music may be delightful, but a low tone in aberration is not. Physical pain engrams are a major ARC break between theta and mest. By our Dianetic theory, theta and mest have a certain native affinity for each other. But when the collision or impact of one against the other is too great or too sudden, a reversal of polarity takes place, and this affinity is changed to a lower-level manifestation. Theta and mest coming together at 4.0 would be in complete harmony with each other. A working organism would result wherein the chemicals and compounds in space and time running on mest energy would be motivated and animated by the ideas and experience of theta energy, and a high level of survival would be postulated. Given a little physical pain, however, a slight drop on the tone scale occurs, since the theta and mest have lost some affinity for each other, are not in such good communication with each other, and thus cannot attain such harmonious agreement or reality as to their purposes. It is a mission of mest to survive or succumb. It is a mission of theta to survive or succumb. The purposes have parallels between theta and mest. When theta and mest are in union on a harmonious level, one could say that the ARC of theta forms a nearly perfect and resonant chord with mest. When physical pain occurs, a slight amount of dissonance results. This dissonance is insufficient to cause a separation of theta and mest until 2.0 on the tone scale is reached. After this, the dissonance is so great that theta is antagonistic to mest, but still operating. At 1.5, an active and violent discord exists to separate the theta from the mest. Lower, the dissonance grows wider. By the time 0.5 is reached, a near null of dissonance has been descended to, which makes the theta almost inactive with mest. At 0.1, this null has become so wide that the two are not existing together at all, and at 0.0, death is reached for the organism. There is the overall life of the organism, which could be said to be the theta body. Then there is somatic life, or the life of cells. The life of cells persists below organism death, but as the basic organism, life and the mest have mutually rejected each other. Somatic life, unless assisted by other organisms, as in the experiments of Alexis Carrel, dies away within the next few minutes or a year, thus producing complete organism death and leaving in its place the mest compounds which have been organized by the theta and which are themselves a sort of evolution of mest. It is at 2.0, and the tone scale is somewhat arbitrary, though based on observation and workable, that loss of life has set in. Separation of theta from mest is necessary in the absence of processing for the chronically inturbulated individual or group from 2.0 down. Momentary inturbulation because of environmental circumstances brings about the same intention. This intention, when manifested at anger, is not immediately observable, but anger is destruction and death. From there on down, loss becomes more and more likely. There is a distinct parallel on the tone scale between the position of the individual, the condition of the theta, and the way mest is handled by theta. At 4.0, theta is handling mest with great adequacy. At 3.5, there is a little less certainty on theta's part in handling mest. At 3.0, theta has, through learning it can lose mest, become conservative in its handling of mest. At 2.5, theta is handling mest in a relatively lackadaisical fashion, since it is not well convinced that it can continue to do so. At 2.0, theta is unable to handle mest adequately enough, and so begins to reject mest and to attempt to eject itself from mest. At 1.5, theta is determined to reject mest and to eject itself from mest, but its determination is still directed at all the mest surrounding it, not so much at the organism in which it is contained. It is attempting at this level to eject the organism from the environment by destroying the environment. At 1.1, the stratum of fear has been entered. The theta in the organism has to be very careful how it destroys the area around it for the organism, but the ejection of itself from the organism and the rejection of the environment is none the less certain. Here the organism is still functioning, but is under threat of loss. At 0.5, the organism has accepted the fact that the theta and mest will separate and that the environment contains no survival factors, but only non-survival factors. At 0.1, death has been accepted by the organism as a condition of a death environment. A study of this demonstrates an evident third factor in the theta-mest theory. The organism itself has an intention of survival, possibly even when the theta and mest composing the organism have determined to separate. Much theory can be postulated concerning this. That which is interesting to us in processing is that below 2.0, the theta intention is towards separation from mest, either the separation of the organism from mest by the destruction of the environment or the destruction of the organism itself. Theta has many choices in the way this can be accomplished. Survival is often obtained by an organism through the agency of another organism. As the mistletoe lives upon the life of an oak, so may an individual exist by virtue of a powerful ally. Any child has in his parents allies which assist his survival. The child, if these parents materially assist the survival of the child and yet deny the child his self-determinism, begins to live almost as though he were the parents. The theta of the child becomes invested, one might say, in the theta of the parents. It might be said that the theta of an individual, when it is suppressed from the control of its own organism, can commingle with the theta of other organisms. This is an unexplored observation, but this much is certain. the theta of any individual may identify itself with the theta of the individuals around to such a degree that the death or even the illness of the surrounding individuals, one or more, may cause the same reduction on the tone scale of the dependent individual. This could be worked out on the basis of restimulation in the environment, but it seems to have deeper significance than that. The auditor will often find his preclear so thoroughly associated with another individual who is dead that his preclear, upon going into a session, may cross his hands upon his chest as though he were a corpse. Investigation of the situation demonstrates that this preclear has lost a powerful ally, such as his mother, grandmother, father, grandfather, or guardian, and that the preclear is stopped on the time track at the moment of death of this ally. This preclear's theta has become so thoroughly associated with the theta of another that when the other person died, the preclear to all intents and purposes died himself, but continued to live as an organism, though thoroughly interrupted as an identity. This confusion of identities between one person and another is severely aberrative. By straight memory technique, an auditor can begin to separate identities out of his preclear, discovering in the preclear habits and patterns of thought and action, and finding who in the past had these patterns of thought and action. The preclear may identify the person to whom these habits and actions really belonged, and thus, to that degree, regains his own personal identity. Personal identity is very important. It is a parallel to self-determinism. When the individual's identity has been absorbed to a great degree in the personality of another person, another way of saying the commingling of theta, a loss of personality ensues with a consequent reduction of analytical dynamic and ability to reason. It is very important for the auditor to cause this separation. The secondary engram may consist of any misemotion from 2.0 down the scale. First, there is antagonism because of a threat of loss of survival components to the individual. Then there is anger toward the sources that threaten loss. Then there is fear that loss will occur, either loss of one's own life or loss of one's allies. Then there is the level of the accomplished fact of loss, whether of position, of persons, or of things. This is the level of grief. Next, there is the level where loss is not only accomplished, but the individual thinks, because of this loss, that he himself and all around him is lost. This is apathy. Finally, the loss is so thoroughly accepted that the environment and everything in it are renounced, and life itself is renounced as lost. This is pretended death, only a decimal above actual death. Here we have the dwindling spiral. All locks actually lie below 2.0 on the tone scale if they are themselves aberrative. These are the minor threats to survival, the introduction of minor components into the life of the individual which threaten his existence. There are many of these. They are of small volume, such as momentary incidents of fear and losses of small possessions. Other persons' losses may form locks where engrams exist earlier in the case, which contain the physical pain which makes possible the entrapment of the entheta. The secondary engram is a large volume affair. In the secondary engram, one has, at 2.0, antagonisms felt because of major losses which are threatened. At 1.5, one has the anger because of a threatened major loss. At 1.1, one has the fear that a major loss will occur. At 0.5, one has the grief because a major loss has occurred and an apathy resulting because of the apparent inability to recover what has been lost. At 0.1, we have such a magnitude of losses that life is unsupportable, and the entire environment seems to the individual to have collapsed and become dead itself. The secondary engram can then consist of a major antagonism, a major anger, a major fear amounting to terror, a major grief, or a major apathy, or a major concept of nothing but death. Here we have a gradient scale of major threats of losses, and results of losses. A child has many momentary or fleeting moments of fear or grief because of lack of data. Very little of this in turbulence is of lasting consequence, which is to say that it does not become trapped, because the child has few engrams in restimulation ordinarily. However, in the processing of children, one can run off many fear and grief incidents, since there is some residual lag in the inturbulence. The very major secondaries in an adult are normally quite few. but these consist of such violent impacts from the environment in terms of threats of loss or loss that, engrams being already restimulated, great quantities of theta are interbulated and insisted in the form of secondary engrams. The running of a secondary and its complete exhaustion from the case is of enormous importance. There are those who, knowing that every secondary engram exists only by virtue of the physical pain engram which underlies it, and who themselves are afraid of grief, hopefully attempt to audit individuals by avoiding secondary engrams and attempting to run the physical pain engrams instead. The physical pain engrams, bluntly, will not exhaust unless the grief is run first. The secondary engram is reduced by the physiological discharge of tears or possibly some other bodily fluids. Grief seems to be reducible only in terms of tears. Fear or terror inelegantly seems to be reducible in terms of urine, sweat, and other bodily excretion. Anger seems to be reducible by certain physical excretion. Apathy is reducible simply by running the feeling of apathy, and this is accomplished by certain physiological symptoms. It is worthy of notice that another column could have been added to this chart, which already contains so many columns. This would be the column of body odor. The body is normally sweet-smelling down to 2.0, but begins to exude, chronically, certain unpleasant effluvia from 2.0 down. Individuals from 2.0 down commonly have bad breath. Their feet may have a considerable odor. The musk glands are very active. The sweat has a peculiar smell. Sexual organs emit a repelling odor, and various bodily exhaust functions are not under very good control. The person may have to urinate or defecate under slight stresses, or may weep easily for no apparent cause. This column has not been added to this chart because it has not been thoroughly explored, but is only known in a general way. Any slightly or greatly repulsive physical odor from an individual does, however, indicate a tone scale position below 2.0. It is amusing to note that in the Orient, wives are commonly selected by the sweetness of their perspiration. This is apparently a very reliable test for position on the tone scale. People who have bad breath, as they are processed, lose it when they are above 2.0 on the tone scale. People who are even temporarily suppressed below 2.0 commonly have bad breath. A secondary engram is run exactly as one would run an engram. One starts at the earliest moment of the engram that one can discover and proceeds, picking up all perceptics, to the end of the engram. One then goes back to the beginning and re-experiences it again. The auditor continues to have the pre-clear re-experience the incident until the pre-clear with regard to this secondary engram is at a high position on the tone scale. If the secondary engram is one of anger, the pre-clear will readily come up through boredom and commonly to false 4. If it is fear, the pre-clear will come up through anger, boredom, and again to false 4. If the secondary engram begins with grief, it will proceed commonly through grief, up through fear, up through anger, up through boredom, and to false 4. If the secondary is an apathy secondary, it will proceed first through apathy, which is very hard-going, then through grief, then through fear, then through anger, then through boredom, and to false 4. A pretended death engram is a much deeper apathy and much more difficult to run. Much theta must be accumulated from other portions of the case before a pretended death engram can be run. The auditor should never make the error of thinking that the concept is the engram. He should do his best to coax the pre-clear into every single perceptic as a secondary or any other engram is run off. However, at the beginning of running a secondary, only the vaguest concept of it or only some small phrase out of it may be available. The auditor, by causing the pre-clear to repeat this many times, may be able to get more of the engram and so work it out until it lies there in its entirety and can be re-experienced, at which time the pre-clear will come up the tone scale. Getting any misemotion off a case is beneficial to the case. It may be possible only to work out a secondary engram partly, but the auditor should never make the mistake of permitting a pre-clear to leave a secondary engram before it is exhausted of all possible misemotion. Every secondary should be brought as high up the tone scale as possible. The auditor, further, should not make the mistake of abandoning the engram at the point of antagonism. Occasionally, the pre-clear, on recounting this experience all the way through with all possible perceptics, will get to the point where he is flippant about the circumstance. This flippancy is nearly always rendered in phrases which still remain in the secondary or the engram. The auditor may find a bit of resistance from the preclear at the antagonism level, but he will do well to continue running the engram. It will then come up to boredom. The preclear has to be persuaded to go through it again. He will ordinarily state that he is bored with it. This is not good enough. Further recounting is necessary to bring it up to the desirable tone level. It must be remembered, as it will not be remarked again, that misemotion is part of every physical pain engram. The misemotion will rise up the scale out of an engram just as it will rise up the scale out of a secondary. Do not neglect the secondary engram's importance in the case. For example, the newly made widow of a very successful man, 1 week after his burial, had become physically ill, wore weeds, looked some 10 years older, and could not face any portion of existence. An auditor worked with her for 9 hours and ran out her husband's death completely. At the end of this time, she looked younger than she had looked for some years, was able to dress and to meet life with considerable aplomb. The change was so remarkable after this 9 hours of processing that one would not have been able to recognize her as the same woman who had entered the session under the duress of this secondary. A Minnesota multiphasic test given to some individuals before and after the running only of secondary engrams showed these individuals, before the secondaries were run and discharged, to lie above the severely aberrated line, and after the secondaries had been run and discharged, to be well within the normal range. There is nothing more spectacular in the rise of a case on the tone scale than that which takes place after the discharging of one or more secondary engrams. This is particularly true of grief engrams, but others also produce beneficial effects. The reason for this seems to be that the physical pain engram makes possible secondary engrams in locks, but the secondaries entrap the majority of the theta on the case and keep it as N theta in an insisted condition. The auditor should pay very particular attention to his own attitude when he is attempting to run a secondary engram on the preclear. The present social order has a considerable compunction against crying or showing fear, and a general inhibition of displays of misemotion and emotion. When these inhibitions lie in the form of circuits, as will be covered later, it is difficult to get the secondary engram to exhaust. However, if the auditor is demonstrating a high level of ARC, if he seems sympathetic, his work will be made much easier. The preclear cannot run secondary engrams in the presence of an auditor for whom he has antagonisms. The auditor thus must be compatible with the preclear, and must have been cleared with the preclear, as a group of two, if he expects to run any secondary engrams on this preclear. The file clerk and somatic strip, as will be covered in the running of engrams, are not particularly reliable in the presence of secondary engrams. Here we have enormous quantities of N theta, and so theta entities such as the somatic strip and file clerk have difficulty approaching such areas. However, the recovery and conversion of considerable N theta from locks will bring the case up the tone scale to a point where the analytical mind will have enough free theta to attack the secondaries. The primary reason why an individual is severely aberrated is, of course, secondary engrams. If the individual is well down the tone scale, one can assume as a matter of course that he has a large number of heavy secondary engrams, whether the individual is able to run these secondaries or not, for here we have the main deposits of N theta on a case. Certain auditors, because of their sympathy and their ability to develop a high ARC with the preclear, become experts in the running of secondary engrams. Anyone to whom people will tell their troubles will be able to run secondary engrams. The process of running a secondary engram does not differ from running a physical pain engram. This is very important. The secondary engram is called secondary because it depends upon an earlier physical pain engram to exist, being itself occasioned by a conscious moment of loss. It is called an engram in order to focus the attention of the auditor on the fact that it must be run as an engram and that all perceptics possible must be exhausted from it. It occasionally will occur that after lock scanning a preclear over a certain chain of locks, the auditor will suddenly find that the preclear is in a secondary engram. Perhaps some phrase will suggest itself, and the individual will cry or show fear. The auditor should cause this phrase to be repeated over and over. Perhaps neither the auditor nor the preclear knows the source of this phrase, but the exhaustion of it, by itself, may, in a heavily occluded case, bring about a considerable rise, if momentary, on the tone scale. It may occur that after lock scanning, a whole secondary will lie ready to be run. The auditor should then run it. The existence of circuits on a case, which is to say the existence of suppressors to secondary engrams or to any other n-theta, should not be exaggerated in importance. Scanning of locks and straight memory can either locate the locks of the circuit or the circuit to some extent may be ignored. The circuit is a favorite alibi of the auditor. Nearly everyone who is low on the tone scale has been suppressed by the dominations or nullifications of persons or the environment. It must be remembered that the circuit derives from the engram and is charged up by n-theta. The n-theta can be to some degree converted into theta, thus nullifying the circuit without discovering the engram in which this particular circuit is contained. Secondary engrams, or at least phrases from them, can be discharged from any case, no matter how occluded. It is simply a matter of recovering enough free theta so that the individual has a sufficient quantity of free theta to make the exhaustion of secondaries possible. It should be remembered that when a case is overburdened with n-theta, light and cat-footed methods can still bring to the pre-clear enough theta so that the n-theta can be attacked. A secondary engram, being a very heavy deposit of n-theta, will repel theta. The auditor will occasionally discover a pre-clear who will run imaginary secondaries with enormous effect in terms of terror, grief, or apathy. He is dealing here with circuits, which will be covered later, which will furnish physical manifestations, but which will not exhaust engrams. An individual can have a portion of the analyzer segmented off by charge, and under the command of an engram statement to the effect that he must run grief. As a result, the individual will manufacture grief incidents. An engramic command, such as, "You are always afraid and you imagine things to be afraid of," or any of a multitude of approximations, may cause the individual to manufacture and run fear incidents. The reality of such incidents is very low, but the individual will run them and manifest fear. Unfortunately, these incidents do not produce any alleviation of aberration in the case. This is a manifestation of dub-in. It is very easily distinguished from real incidents, since the pre-clear hardly ever is able to repeat the same incident in the same way a second time, and since the pre-clear is anxious to sell the auditor on the idea that the incident is very real, although the auditor has made no suggestion that it might be unreal. The auditor uses as his yardstick the probability of the incident, but he is not particularly worried about one incident. A circuit has the habit of manufacturing the same type of incident over and over and over again, but locating it at various points on the time track. The pre-clear, if he is very low on the tone scale, may himself be unaware of the reality of this incident. But the auditor, knowing the pre-clear to be low on the tone scale, suspects the possibility of dub-in when the pre-clear runs 5 or 10 incidents in which he is tied to a railroad track by his mother and is rescued at the last moment by his aunt. Here is delusion rampant. The pre-clear will manifest considerable relief after running the incident. But here is a circuit at work, and no matter how many times this incident is run, the condition of the pre-clear will not be bettered. The auditor, by giving credence to this incident and by continuing to run it, is actually validating the incident and strengthening the circuit. Such incidents are usually bizarre and sensational. Very often, however, the auditor actually has on his hands incidents which are quite true and are bizarre and sensational, since the things done to human beings in this 20th century are not always tame and routine. The test of any secondary is whether or not it runs the individual up the tone scale. When the auditor discovers that he is running fear or apathy charges on the account of some circuit, he should immediately be aware of the fact that he is trying to address much too heavy a form of n-theta. He should not be running secondaries, but should be running locks. A pre-clear who will run such dub-in misemotion is very, very low on the tone scale. An estimate of this pre-clear on the chart would have told the auditor in the first place that the pre-clear was low on the scale. The auditor should thus be alert for dub-in. Dub-in misemotion is best handled not by running 30 consecutive incidents in which the pre-clear is placed in the washing machine by his father or hoisted up a flagpole by his elder brother, but by addressing the locks in the case. The nearer present time, the better. Very shortly, the auditor will discover that the environment of this pre-clear is normally very restimulative, and that individuals exist in the environment of this pre-clear who habitually lay in heavy locks. Further, the auditor will discover in lock scanning that this pre-clear will commonly hang up in locks after the chain has been scanned, and that the locks themselves have to be run as incidents. Such a pre-clear should not be subjected to the mishandling of being run through heavy secondary engrams. Of course, in a wide-open case, on which few occlusions exist, actual secondaries might be run fairly early in the case with an enormous rebound up the tone scale. It is in the occluded case that the auditor should expect to find circuits which produce misemotion at will. The auditor who is handling a pre-clear above 1.5 should not much worry about dubbed-in misemotion. On the subject of secondary engrams, the auditor, regardless of his own personal feelings about fear, grief, or apathy, should keep firmly in mind the relief which is obtainable for the pre-clear and the rise which is possible on the tone scale by running secondary engrams. It is a theoretical truth that a case would become a release if the auditor could run off of the case only the secondary engrams in their entirety. This is impossible in practice, since after a secondary has been run, the auditor quite commonly finds that he is running a physical pain engram which underlies it. The auditor should not be surprised when he is running a secondary engram to find, after the exhaustion of a few tears, physical pain turning on as a consequence. Clears are produced by running all the physical pain engrams, secondaries, and locks off a case. But engrams quite ordinarily cannot be contacted until locks have been scanned and secondaries have been run off of a case. It is an adroit auditor who can elicit from some hard-boiled and emotionless denizen of our culture the tears or fear necessary to resolve his case. But the scanning of lock chains or the running of available physical pain engrams off of a case will place in the auditor's hands willy-nilly discharge of secondary engrams. The auditor can convert the n-theta of locks to theta to such a degree that secondary engrams will begin to discharge almost automatically. At such time as this happens, the auditor must be careful to minimize his own conversation or comment, to minimize his auditing, simply sympathetically persuading the pre-clear to run the incident again and then again and then again until it is exhausted. The auditor, by attacking secondary engrams as though they were game on which the state pays a bounty, such as jackals or crows, and using an approach too exhilarated or enthusiastic toward the pre-clear secondaries, can actually cut off the discharge of misemotion. Some experiments have been carried out on the use of sad music or other dolorous perceptics in the environment of the pre-clear to encourage the discharge of secondary engrams. Much work can be done on this. The work which has been done demonstrates, however, that individuals who are chronically very low on the tone scale respond to sad and mournful perceptics by simply running dub-in incidents which do them no good, and that individuals above this level can commonly discharge secondaries whenever the proper amount of theta has been recovered for the case. This does not discount the possible use of aesthetic perceptics in the encouragement of secondaries. In inventorying a pre-clear, one should be careful to establish all the major losses and major threats of loss that have happened to the pre-clear in his lifetime. On each one of the losses or threats of loss, either of position or possessions or people by departure or death, one will find an insistment of n-theta. Where the child has been raised by nurses in the vicinity of relatively antagonistic parents, one may expect to find a secondary engram every time a nurse is discharged. In the coffin case, who lies with arms folded, never assuming the fetal position when running prenatal engrams, but always lying as though laid out for burial, one will certainly find the death of a major ally somewhere back on the track where the n-theta surrounding such an incident is strong enough to paralyze the individual at this point of his life. The secondary engram responsible for the coffin case is ordinarily not contactable early in the case. The auditor should merely continue, alert to the fact that sooner or later he is going to encounter a very heavy charge on the death of an ally. In such a case, the amount of n-theta in relation to the existing theta on the case is very heavy. Lock scanning, straight memory, and the running of locks and even merely perception of present time may be the only processing which can be delivered to the case in its early stages. Sooner or later, some secondaries will be discharged. No physical pain engram should ever be run on such a case. Imaginary incidents are peculiarly useful to the processing of such a case as limited by the chart. The best skill an auditor can develop is the running of secondaries. Their discharge produces the most effective rise up the tone scale. Chapter 13, Column AI, Engrams. The basic cause of all human aberration is apparently the engram. There may be other causes more fundamental than the engram, but certainly to date they have not been discovered. Psychotherapy found out about locks, but did not know they were locks, and did not know to what the lock owed its power. But psychotherapists did know that when an individual was able to remember certain mentally painful incidents in his life, he became to some minute degree better. Sigmund Freud discovered the lightest type of N-theta, and although he placed his probes no deeper, an entrance was made into the field of human behavior. The secondary was discovered, but not identified in any way. By sheer observation of numberless cases, it was found that once in a while, when a patient could be made to cry, the patient got better. The therapist did not know what the patient was crying about, and neither did the patient. But the strange title of release of affect was assigned to this crying, and much extraneous technology was developed around it. Psychodrama and other techniques were developed in order to make the individual release affect. This was the second slight incursion into the field of human thought. If the results were not all that could be desired, it was because they overlooked the important Dianetic fact that secondaries were restimulated more often than they were relieved. Secondaries have to be run as engrams, with the preclear returned on the time track. The leap which was made between psychotherapy and Dianetics did not gather force in psychotherapy, but in an independent study of epistemology and thought as an energy. However, the basic teachings of Sigmund Freud, as relayed to me in the 1920s by Commander Thompson, Medical Corps, U.S. Navy, who had studied with Sigmund Freud, considerably enhanced my desire for re-examination of thought in human behavior. The existence of the engram was predicted by derived computation from other observations of thought. Investigation showed this existence to be actual. Anyone can discover an engram with great ease once he knows that it exists. Take an individual, tell him to close his eyes and go back to the last time he received some minor injury, do not ask for a major injury, and request that he re-experience the moment of injury. Cause him to recount and re-experience this moment of minor injury several times. If he cannot do so, he is fairly low on the tone scale, and his somatics are shut off. Most normal people can re-experience these moments of injury. In causing an individual to do this, the experimenter will find that the injury is again felt and that the sights, sounds, smells, and other perceptics at the moment the injury was received again occur to the experimental subject. Another phenomenon will be discovered by the alert investigator. It will be found that the individual, on the first return to and recounting of this moment of minor injury, will conceive it to be shorter than it actually was. On recounting, he will discover, during the instant of impact of the injury, new perceptics showing up, things he did not notice at the time he was injured. Here is a moment when the analytical mind, even though the injury was slight, went out of circuit. And here is a moment of unconsciousness, wherein the reactive mind was recording all the perceptics which were available in the environment. As these hidden perceptics are recovered, the additional perceptic of physical injury, which is called in Dianetics a somatic, will reduce in force. And unless the experimental subject is extremely aberrated, he will finally no longer be able to feel it, but all other perceptics which were recorded during that moment of physical pain and unconsciousness will be restored to the analytical mind as standard memory data. In effect, this is a Dianetic assist. The auditor may take an individual who has been injured and run the injury as an engram, even though it contains extensive unconsciousness. The last engram on the case has had relatively little chance to become charged up by locks and secondaries, and so is available for auditing regardless of the pre-existing engrams on the case. The auditor can walk into a maternity ward and take over the case of some young mother who, through an arduous birth, has developed a postpartum psychosis, and can audit out the birth in its entirety, unless this young mother was extremely low on the tone scale in the first place, so that she cannot re-experience somatics. the discharge of the actual delivery, perceptic by perceptic, including the unconsciousness induced by anesthesia, everything the surgeon, and let it be hoped that surgeons of tomorrow's America learn to keep their mouths shut, said to the nurse and remarked in general. In the analytical mind's interpretation of the remarks made during this delivery, the source of the postpartum psychosis will be discovered. Any late or recent injury can be run in such a fashion. The individual who is receiving this auditing will, according to observation, recover much more rapidly from the illness or accident. The healing will be cleaner, the incidence of infection will be less, and the seriousness of the injury and the shock contained in it will be greatly reduced by the reduction of the moment of injury itself. It is hoped that sooner or later an auditor will stand at the emergency entrance of some hospital simply to audit all accident victims who come in, and that the statistics of infection rate and mortality rate of this hospital's patients will be compared with those of other hospitals. Evidence indicates that the mortality rate will be much lower on those who have had the last injury audited out, that the incidence of infection will be less, and that the time of recovery of the patient will be greatly shortened by this Dianetic assist. The making of this experiment on a slight scale, regardless of the Dianetic assist, should demonstrate to the experimenter that physical pain at once inhibits consciousness, and that in the presence of physical pain, all the perceptics of the environ, sight, smell, hearing, tactile, etc., are recorded elsewhere than in the analytical mind, but that the running of the incident removes from the case the mental loginess caused by the unconsciousness itself, that all aberrative effects of remarks made during the incident are removed, and that the physical pain is no longer stored, being a highly perishable quantity. This is the anatomy of an engram. It contains physical pain. It contains a greater or lesser shutdown of the analytical mind, conscious mind. It contains all the perceptics of the environment in which the physical pain was received. It contains the physiological condition of the body, including endocrine balance at the time. It includes the age of the individual. It includes the misemotion or emotion contained in the incident as manifested by persons around the injured person. It contains unconsciousness in the form of anaton, analytical attenuation. It contains the interruption of the computations the person was making at the time, which is the interruption of the theta creative cycle and is slightly aberrative. And it contains additionally all the locks and secondaries which, by contagion during the restimulation of the engram, it caused the person to receive while analytically awake or conscious at later times. These are the things which an engram contains. And these are the things which exhaust from an engram which is thoroughly erased. When the engram is approximated in the environment during a time when the individual, by reason of weariness or illness or stress of other kinds, is less analytically aware, various manifestations may occur by reason of the above-mentioned contents of the engram. The individual who is under the stress of a restimulated engram will attempt to dramatize the engram. That is to say, he will say the things contained in the engram and he will do the things dictated by the engram, or he will make the analytical computations demanded by the engram, and he will generally try to comply with the dictates of this moment of physical pain. If his environment makes it impossible for him to carry out this dramatization as dictated by the charged-up engram, then he is subjected to further charge by reason of not being able to do what the end theta of the engram commands him to do. An individual who has had his dramatizations broken time after time gradually descends down the tone scale. Engrams are based on the non-survival circumstance of theta and mest colliding too sharply together with the attendant reversal of polarity. All engrams, even those which are highly complementary to the ability of the individual, such as hypnotic suggestions, which are a light form of engram and depend on early physical pain engrams, are non-survival. There is no such thing as an engram which assists an individual in his business of living. The engram merely uses some natural ability of the individual and may feverishly but inefficiently reinforce it. This would be a manic engram. Engrams dictate unalterable courses of action without any regard to reason. Such a circumstance is, to a greater or lesser degree in every case, non-survival, since the survival of the individual depends upon his ability to adjust his action to the environment or to adjust the environment to him according to the circumstances. The engram is as steady as a phonograph record. It dictates that a person do certain things in the presence of certain perceptions. In an unthinking organism, such as the lower forms of life, the engram does provide a certain method of thinking and acting. But in man, who depends upon reason as his chief weapon, the engram is non-survival in the extreme. The accumulation of engrams and their secondaries and locks brings the individual eventually to the point of death. Although his theta may, by continual interpolation with mest, be highly informed at the period of death with regard to mest, and may, according to some observations, be able in the next generation to accomplish a much better course of survival, in the existing generation the n-theta never frees itself except by Dianetic processing. Yet the auditor will continually discover preclears low on the tone scale, who, by education or by the content of the engrams themselves, will seek to hold on to the engrams in the belief that they are an aid in the business of living. The auditor should thoroughly ignore this situation. In a very short time he will, by his own experience, see very clearly that the relief of engrams vastly increases the preclear's ability to meet life and to advance in the business of living. There are cases which contain engrams, such as attempted abortions, and which seek to retain the engram because it says, "If I lose it, I'll die." Many engrams contain phrases which seem to make the engram valuable. The engram is never valuable. Here is non-survival in the most basically known package. The engram is the basic source of human aberration. There are usually hundreds or even 2,000 or 3,000 engrams in the lifetime of any individual. Each and every one of these may have its own locks. The whole language of the individual may be contained basically in his engrams. Compulsive and obsessive phrases, circuit phrases, which set up computive sections in the analyzer, psychosomatic illnesses, which are now known as chronic somatics, and aberrative forms of thought, to say nothing of reduced physical state and disabilities as represented on the tone scale chart, result basically from engrams. It should be understood by the auditor, however, that although the basic source of human aberration is the engram, according to accumulated evidences, he should not therefore consider that the only thing he should touch in a case is an engram. Locks and secondaries in low-tone cases must be addressed long before he touches engrams. The moment of physical pain and unconsciousness is basic, but it is not the principal point of address in very aberrated cases. Cases fairly well up the tone scale, however, have engrams available for running, and when these engrams are run, remarkable improvements in the habits, welfare, behavior, and physical health of the individual ensue. Before the auditor runs engrams off a case, there are certain definite things he should know. He need not be nearly as skilled to run locks as he need be to run engrams. A very inexperienced auditor can successfully scan locks or even run minor secondaries. But an auditor should definitely know his tools and have confidence in them before he attacks engrams. In the first place, it is possible to enter a deceptively open but really heavily charged case and attempt to run engrams when the preclear is completely unable to perceive enough of the perceptics in the engram to bring about a reduction. Thus the auditor leaves an engram in restimulation and does not much assist the preclear, but on the contrary, may turn some of the preclear's theta back into n-theta by causing the engram to have a new lock by reason of auditing. While all auditing can be scanned off, and this theta can be recovered, it does not improve the case. Further, engrams in the hands of an inexperienced auditor are sometimes improperly evaluated, which is to say, the auditor may attack one which is very late in life or very late on a chain of engrams, and work and worry on the thing until it merely goes into recession. 2 or 3 days later, this engram will reappear. This is because it has not been really reduced or erased, because the auditor did not know enough to go earlier in the case in order to find the basic engram on the chain. Thus, certain cautions must be observed in running engrams, but they can be run successfully if these cautions are observed. To run engrams, the auditor must be aware of and have confidence in the tools of his trade. These consist of the somatic strip, the file clerk, the time track, and the perceptics. The file clerk is an extremely useful mechanism, not only for the running of engrams, but for the scanning of locks, the discovery of locks, and for obtaining data from the standard memory banks which would otherwise be occluded. The file clerk is a response mechanism which is instantaneous. One could postulate that the file clerk is a group of attention units with ready access to the reactive mind and to the standard memory bank, and which, in common mental operation, forwards data through to I as memory. However, the charge on a case, the amount of n theta may be so very heavy that the file clerk is unable to force through the data desired by I, and so I, working all alone with the file clerk, sometimes finds it difficult to receive answers to his questions. The auditor adds, with his demands and signals, what might be considered the additional power necessary to bring the file clerk answers through to I. This process is extremely simple. The auditor asks questions, normally, which can be answered in terms of yes or no, or numbers or dates. Then, at a sharp snap of the auditor's fingers, a sudden thought, a yes or a no, occurs to the pre-clear, who tells the auditor what response he has received. For example, the auditor may desire to know the place where the pre-clear is stuck on the time track, or whether or not the pre-clear is in present time. The auditor says, "Give me the first number that flashes into your mind. How old are you?" An age flashes, and the pre-clear tells the auditor. It may be that the pre-clear has developed a circuit which gives his chronological age in answer to the question, "How old are you?" A double check for the auditor, then, is to ask the question, "What is your age?" He may or may not get the same answer as before, since the circuit may not be educated to the second question. Another method of establishing where the pre-clear is on the time track is to ask for the year, the month, and date. In addition to the location of the pre-clear on the time track, or discovering the point in the pre-clear's life where a certain incident occurred, the flash answer mechanism will tell the auditor at the end of the session whether or not the pre-clear is in present time. The pre-clear should always be brought to present time if possible, either by simply being told to come to present time or by being scanned up to present time through pleasure moments. The auditor works with the file clerk. The auditor does not order the file clerk around. The auditor consults the file clerk. The file clerk will tell the auditor the name of the chain of locks which is to be scanned. The file clerk, questioned by flash answers, will tell the auditor whether or not a chain can be scanned. The file clerk will, questioned by flash answers, identify types of incidents which are interrupting the case. In short, the file clerk is a consultant who answers with specific data any question asked with the flash answer mechanism. It is interesting that material completely unknown to the analyzer of the pre-clear can be discovered by questioning the file clerk. The somatic strip is so called because it seems to be a physical indicator mechanism which has to do with time. The auditor orders the somatic strip. There is this difference between the file clerk and the somatic strip. He works with the file clerk, but commands the somatic strip. On command, the somatic strip will go to any point of the pre-clear's life unless the n theta on the case is so heavy that the somatic strip is frozen in one place. This might be called, as well, the concentration of attention of I. The somatic strip goes to the point of return, but it is not the same as completely returning, since the pre-clear's I can stay in present time and the somatic strip can be sent back to earlier periods of his life. This is a very useful mechanism. The somatic strip can be sent back to the beginning of an engram and will go there. The somatic strip will advance through an engram in terms of minutes counted off by the auditor, so that the auditor can say that the somatic strip will go to the beginning of the engram, then to the point 5 minutes after the engram began, and so forth. In such a way, observing the behavior of the pre-clear, who may be oblivious of what is taking place except by observing his own physical symptoms change, the auditor can send the pre-clear through an operation minute by minute or in larger increments, and the auditor can tell with certainty exactly how long that operation required. The somatic strip can be sent to a certain date, hour, and minute in the pre-clear's life and will go there. I in the pre-clear does not necessarily follow the somatic strip. Unless a case is very heavy with n theta, the somatic strip, for instance, can be sent by the auditor's command back to the moment when the pre-clear, as a baby, was being burped. Much to his own astonishment, the pre-clear might then burp. The auditor can send the somatic strip to a moment when the pre-clear was sunburned, and the sunburned somatic will turn on. The somatic strip, in short, can be sent all up and down the time track. both to pleasant moments and unpleasant ones, by the auditor, even though the pre-clear may be relatively unwilling to cooperate. This is definitely not power of suggestion, since the pre-clear is wide awake and alert. Further, the auditor in commanding the somatic strip can discover data such as how long an operation took, which is evidently completely unknown to the pre-clear, although this use of the somatic strip is neither usual nor general, but is more of a stunt. The main thing the auditor should do in using the somatic strip is to credit the somatic strip with obedience to the auditor's commands. The auditor does not send the somatic strip to the beginning of the engram and then wonder whether or not the somatic strip went there and ask questions as to whether or not it did and how the pre-clear feels. The auditor, with considerable confidence, should assume that the somatic strip has gone exactly where he said. If the pre-clear is unable to detect any difference, this is not the fault of the somatic strip, but is occasioned by the amount of N-theta on the case. The somatic strip moves about the track at the auditor's commands regardless of the quantity of N-theta on the case, unless the somatic strip is itself thoroughly stuck in some engram. The somatic strip and the file clerk are two of many mechanisms and entities discovered by Dianetics. There are many other phenomena in the mind, which are not at this time used by the auditor, but which nevertheless exist. There are possibly such things as theta perceptics, which respond to auditor consultation. Very little is known about them, and it is felt that incorrect use of them or invalidation of them after they have been used is harmful to a case, so experimentation with them should be very carefully done. A book could be written which covered additional entities and phenomena of the human mind, but until these can be intimately associated with processing in such a way as to aid the auditor, a discussion of them in a book of processing is extraneous. Exactly to what extent these additional perceptics and entities influence human behavior has been far from thoroughly established. The time track, as covered elsewhere, is simply the consecutive moments of now which proceed in one lifetime from conception or a few days before conception on the sperm and ovum sequence up to present time. The time track is actually a cable or bundle of perceptics, since all 26 perceptic channels register when there is anything for them to perceive and are in phase in a case which does not have an extremely heavy burden of N-theta. The individual can be sent by the auditor back from present time simply by being told to close his eyes and go to a certain moment in the past. He can be sent to a very precise moment on the track, since every instant of the pre-clear's past life is recorded on this track. Some of the recording, of course, is done in the reactive mind when unconsciousness and physical pain are present. It is interesting that a pre-clear can be sent to January 3, 1936, a very random and obscure date, to the hour of 8:15 in the morning. And although the pre-clear may not realize he is there, requesting him to contact even hazy data about it will shortly place him at the instant which, if run several times, just as though it were an engram, will begin to show up in considerable detail in most cases. For instance, if at 8:15 in the morning on January the 3rd, the pre-clear entered his office and began to open mail, he may not know at the beginning even if he had an office at that date. But after he has run the incident several times, he will be able to read you the names and addresses off the envelopes as he opens them and sorts his morning mail. Because sense of time and ability to return are thoroughly discounted by social aberrations in this culture, these skills have remained hidden. When the pre-clear's sense of reality is very low, when he himself is very low on the tone scale, the pre-clear may have no confidence at all in any data which he brings up about his past. Knowing that the somatic strip, the file clerk, and the ability of I to return are accurate, the auditor has the responsibility to encourage the pre-clear to credit his own senses. Thus we see that we have three things at work in the operation of going back from present time to an earlier incident. First we have the file clerk, next we have the somatic strip, and third we have I, or a large percentage of the attention units of the mind. And these three together are used by the auditor to work the pre-clear on his time track and discover and reduce or erase past moments of physical pain and unconsciousness or insisted areas of N-theta. The auditor consults with the file clerk as to the incident necessary to resolve this case, or the chain of locks necessary to be run at this time, or yes or no, should we run engrams at this time, or "Is there a grief charge available at this time?" And after this consultation, asking, "Can we scan this chain of locks at this time?" Or, "Is this engram susceptible to being run?" One might say that the auditor and the file clerk are consultants over the case of the pre-clear as to the best method of raising the pre-clear on the tone scale. The file clerk's interest and participation in this is very large. The file clerk's ability to answer questions sometimes extends to suggestions as to how to run the case when these are requested by the auditor. Now, it is a strange thing that the file clerk always knows the type of entheta which can be run on the case. The file clerk also knows the next engram which can be reduced or erased. All the auditor has to do is request the file clerk to present the engram necessary to resolve the case, and the file clerk will do so, no matter where that engram lies on the track. Engrams follow the general law that they must be reduced or erased from early to late, which is to say that the earliest engram on the chain must be the one first contacted. Engrams in the basic area are surprisingly early. The auditor will have to get used to the idea that physical pain and perceptics are recorded, if not understood, long before there is anything like an analytical mind in the organism. The file clerk is slightly sketchy on how early he must look for the engram to resolve the case, and unless the auditor is occasionally insistent on the file clerk's presenting very, very, very early engrams, the file clerk may not look earlier than 2 or 3 or 5 years of age, late life in Dianetics. With this single limitation, the choice of the file clerk as to the engram to be run should be considered primary above the auditor's or pre-clear's idea of what engram it is now necessary to address and reduce. The auditor cannot know this too thoroughly. The file clerk's choice of engrams takes precedence over the desires of the pre-clear or the wishes of the auditor, and the file clerk will present the engram necessary to be run next in order to resolve the case. Although engrams normally run from early to late, it sometimes happens that a relatively late-life engram is so tenuously connected to the remainder of the bank that it can be run off and erased almost as an independent entity. Although birth should always be approached by the auditor with caution, the file clerk may present birth, and if the file clerk does so, then birth should be run. The auditor should be very careful of forcing his pre-clear into any engram which is not presented by the file clerk. Running late-life engrams early in the case will, as a general rule, merely interbulate the case, since these engrams will not reduce until earlier physical pain moments have been reduced or until a great deal of entheta is taken off of the case by other means. Once the file clerk has presented an engram and the auditor simply assumes that his request for the file clerk to do so has been complied with, the auditor then directs the somatic strip to go to the beginning of the engram. The somatic strip does this immediately and needs no further coaxing, and indeed, a failure to take this for granted has a tendency to invalidate the somatic strip and to render its response uncertain and the pre-clear confused as to what is taking place. With the somatic strip at the beginning of the engram, which the file clerk has presented, there may still be no awareness of somatic or change so far as the pre-clear's eye is concerned. It is now necessary for the auditor to get eye in contact with the stage which has been set by the file clerk and the somatic strip. The auditor does this with an additional request for a flash answer. Although it does not always happen that engrams contain conversation, it is a fairly safe assumption that any given engram contains conversation. In order to get eye in contact with the engram, and to turn the somatic on full so that the engram can be run, the auditor now asks for the first phrase in the engram and snaps his fingers. A phrase occurs to the pre-clear, which at the first moment that it occurs may seem completely irrelevant. The pre-clear repeats this phrase 2 or 3 times, and eye is in contact with the beginning of the engram. The pre-clear becomes aware of the somatic and of other perceptics, and phrase by phrase runs off the engram, re-experiencing it, feeling the generally modified version of the pain the instant once contained, recounting all the conversation which he perceives to have taken place in the incident, getting rid of the boil-off which smothered the incident, or yawning away the remaining anaton in the incident, or experiencing the misemotion of the incident, and, in short, reducing or erasing the engram. The auditor must be aware of the existence and importance of action phrases in engrams, These phrases are actually commands in the engrams, which take over as a sort of inner auditor. And before the auditor knows it, these phrases are sending the somatic strip elsewhere, up or down the track, or mixing up the file clerk as to the next phrases. The auditor, if he notices any peculiarity in the running of this engram, that the somatic turned on once but will not turn on again, that sonic was nearly on but now doesn't exist, and yet knows the engram is not yet reduced, suspects an action phrase and asks the file clerk whether or not a bouncer, denier, grouper, valence shifter, or holder is acting. He does this by saying, "Is there an action phrase present?" With a yes answer, the auditor then asks, "What type?" The file clerk then says, through I, that it is a bouncer, holder, grouper, misdirector, denier, or whatever. The auditor then says, "The phrase will now flash." The phrase flashes, the pre-clear repeats it, and gets back into the engram from which he has been bounced, if it was a bouncer. Actually, a case is in very bad shape which has positive responses to action phrases and probably should not have engrams run on it at all. Cases further up the tone scale do not respond at all to action phrases, which is to say, the file clerk and somatic strip have sufficient theta behind them to override even strong and energetic commands to do something other than work with the auditor in reducing or erasing the engram. The response value of the action phrases is, indeed, an index of where the pre-clear is located on the tone scale. Very noticeable response to action phrases indicates that some other type of end theta than engrams should be run off the case before engrams are reduced. If the auditor finds his pre-clear bouncing badly every time the phrase "get out" occurs in an engram, he should reduce, if possible, the engram on which he is working, and then address his attention to other types of end theta, such as chains of locks and secondaries, rather than continuing to run engrams. The auditor should understand that an engram does not always begin with a phrase, and that the phrase he gets first may not begin the engram. He should further understand that the heaviest end theta in the engram, if the engram were occasioned by a blow, occurs at the beginning of the engram. Thus, the file clerk may present this beginning, and the somatic strip may try to go all the way to the beginning, but the end theta is heaviest right at the start. Thus, the auditor should always check to find out whether there is an earlier phrase or an earlier somatic on the engram before he works very hard to reduce the whole engram, since it is the earliest part of the engram which suppresses the remainder of the engram. Once you get the end theta out of the very beginning of an engram of the blow variety, the rest may reduce as easily as a lock. Always get the earliest part. There is another type of engram in which unconsciousness sets in slowly, and perhaps physical pain does not develop until after unconsciousness has begun to set in. This would happen in the case of loss of blood, or during an anesthetic operation where the anesthesia is administered before the physical pain of the operation itself begins. Then there is the combination of these types of engrams, where a blow or shock begins the engram, unconsciousness sets in and deepens, and then further blows and shocks occur during the course of the unconsciousness, again deepening it. The lightest phrases of unconsciousness will lift off an engram first. The deepest part of the unconsciousness, or the deepest point of physical pain, will lift last. Thus, an auditor can run through an engram several times and consider that he has almost reduced it, only to discover that several new phrases have appeared in the engram. This happens because some portions of the engram contain deeper unconsciousness and more severe pain than other portions, and these lift last. The engram can do three things. It can erase, it can reduce, or it can recess. The erasure of an engram takes place when it is either one of the first few engrams existing on the time track, or when the engram is relatively independent of the remainder of the reactive mind. The phrases and other perceptics appear. The engram is recounted from the first moment of physical pain and unconsciousness to the last, and after a few recountings, the engram vanishes in yawns. The auditor can be fooled at times by having the pre-clear bounce out of an engram into believing that the engram has been erased or reduced. But in this case, yawns do not come off. Yawns always mark the end of an erasure, since this is the last of the anaton, the physiological byproduct of unconsciousness, which has pinned down the rest of the engram. The entire case, which is to say all the content of the reactive mind, will eventually erase. An erasure thoroughly done simply by recounting all perceptics of the engram over and over with the pre-clear returned to that instant on the track does not reappear again. An erasure is final and complete. The engram is gone. The physical pain will not reoccur. The phrases are no longer aberrative in any way and are quite often gone so thoroughly that the pre-clear cannot even remember what the engram contained. In view of the fact that the engram is the basic source of human aberration, these phrases, which are enforced as hidden commands upon the analytical mind, are the most productive of aberration if the engram is charged up by later and theta on the case. If these commands cannot be obeyed or dramatized by the analyzer, then the engram attempts to force compliance by turning on physical pain which it contains. That portion of the body which was injured when this engram was received will become painful again, or will manifest some discomfort. This has been called psychosomatic illness. It is actually the somatic of some past moment of physical pain turning on again because of the overcharge of the engram by later n theta and the inability of the person to dramatize the verbal content of the engram. All these things are gone. The anaton, which shuts down the analytical mechanism and power of the mind, the aberrative force of the commands of the engram, which are accepted literally by the analyzer, and the physical pain of the engram, which can become a chronic somatic, disappear and do not return when the engram is erased. To be erased, an engram has to be early on its own chain of engrams. There must not be too many secondaries or other types of n theta charging up this engram, and the bulk of the perceptics must have been present while the engram was being run. The unobservant auditor who knows little of his subject may occasionally think he has erased engrams, only to discover a few days later that the engram in some part has returned. In order for this to happen, the engram must have been fairly late on a chain, or there must have been considerable n theta above it. The earlier engram must be discovered, or n theta must be removed from the case in some other way. One auditor who was in Dianetics very early, but who left it through his inability and lack of courage in handling psychotic cases, had so much grief on his own case that he was afraid to run grief on any pre-clear. Thus, in any case below 2.0 on the tone scale, he was unable to secure any erasures, for he simply could not bring himself to face the sight of a pre-clear crying, and would quickly and sharply stop any pre-clear who sought to discharge a secondary engram. Rather than face his own inability and unburden cases of their secondary engrams, this individual went to the extraordinary lengths of laboriously trying to change the basic tenets of Dianetics until they agreed with his own engrams. This rather pathetic case is cited to demonstrate to the auditor that he must not permit his own shortcomings to reduce his skill in auditing, but must raise his necessity level and personal courage up to a point where he can run a pre-clear through anything. Before he tries to alter the axioms and practices of Dianetics which have produced results, the person who would audit should begin by using these axioms and practices as they are described in this volume. A reduction is done exactly as an erasure, but the engram will not completely erase, remaining, after a few recountings, in a more or less static condition of low aberrative power and with no physical pain remaining in it. Early in the case, the auditor obtains more reductions than he does erasures. When an erasure of the case begins, the auditor feels very confident, for an erasure carries the pre-clear up the track to present time, and although another pass may be made to discover missed engrams, the auditor knows he is bringing the pre-clear through to clear. In the matter of a reduction, n theta is recovered from the incident, the pre-clear is made considerably more comfortable, but the engram remains there in a quiet state. Ordinarily, erasures and reductions require only 7 to 10 recountings or re-experiencings of the engram. The reduction is recognizable because the somatic in the engram, recounting by recounting, reduces a little further and continues to reduce until the somatic is gone. A reduced engram does not build up again, but remains in this quiet state and permits the auditor to go on to other engrams. The recession is the third thing that will happen to an engram which is being processed. The recession is not desirable. A recession occurs only in engrams which are not early enough in the chain of engrams to be reduced or which are too charged. The file clerk will never present an engram which can only be recessed. A recession takes place when the auditor, knowing better than the file clerk, forces the pre-clear back down the track, uses repeater technique on some phrase the auditor has selected as being aberrative, and generally mishandles the case. A recession is evidenced by the failure of the somatic to reduce beyond a certain point. The engram will drop down to a certain volume of intensity, but no matter if it is recounted 30, 50, or 100 times, a somatic will still remain. In contrast with a reduction, during a recession, the somatic of the engram first reduces slightly and then continues constant. In the reduction, the somatic, little by little, each recounting, reduces. In a recession, the somatic remains steady. If a recession takes place, it means simply that a similar engram to the one which is being re-experienced is earlier on the case, or that a tremendous quantity of n-theta in secondaries and locks exists above the engram that is being recessed. Recessions occur only where the auditor has not taken off enough n-theta from the case in the form of locks and secondaries to permit engrams to be run. It is a premature address to engrams, or it is caused by auditing in violation of the file clerk's data. One would ordinarily suppose, for instance, that conception would be the earliest engram on the case. It sometimes happens that the auditor contacts conception and finds it will not reduce. Obviously, conception is very early. There may be some engrams before conception on either the sperm or the ovum side, but unless one understands that a great deal of charge can exist which suppresses any engram, one may recount, for instance, a conception engram only into a recession. It should not surprise an auditor if he demands that conception be run before conception is ready to be run to have a recession take place. Perhaps no engram exists in current life before conception, but enough n-theta in secondaries and locks above conception will cause its charge to be highly resistive. There is a trick of reaching conception in a case. This trick should be used with caution because of the n-theta which may have charged up this early engram. The auditor asks the pre-clear to run a moment of sexual pleasure, and then when his pre-clear, who does not have to recount this moment aloud, appears to be settled into that moment, the auditor demands that the pre-clear go immediately to conception. The pre-clear will normally do so, and conception can thus be found and run. But, as has been said, it may have too much charge to reduce or erase. This trick can be applied to any engram in the basic area. The auditor can require the pre-clear to run a moment when the pre-clear was angry, and when the pre-clear seems to be well settled into recounting his own near-present-time dramatization of being angry, the auditor merely tells him to go to the earliest engram in the bank which contains anger. The pre-clear ordinarily will go there. This applies as well to fear and to grief, but it is far better to discharge the case well and have the file clerk in good working condition before one uses such a trick. Conception is definitely an engram in the majority of cases. Now and then conception will be found to contain only a moment of unconsciousness in the sperm line and another in the ovum line and be otherwise unaberrative. But the usual conception contains considerable perceptics and physical pain. Great care should be used not to try to contact and run conception prematurely on a case. An individual who is fairly low on the tone scale, below 2.5, will usually have enough charge on conception so that it cannot be reduced. Running conception on an individual below 2.5 intensifies his aberrative manifestations. A borderline psychotic can actually be placed in a psychotic break if an auditor authoritarianly slams him into conception and insists he run it on the theory that conception, being an early engram, should erase. Possibly the mistaken emphasis of outmoded therapies upon the second dynamic occurs because the basic engrams of the case are sexual. This would bring about an incorrect conclusion on the part of those who did not understand the mechanics of aberration. Because Dianetics has not at this time much explored structure, no slightest effort is made here to justify the existence of preconception sperm engrams or preconception ovum engrams or conception engrams or birth engrams. Actually, these have been found time and again in some advanced modes of psychotherapy and abandoned only because they did not agree with the reality of the practitioner. Recent experiments at Rutgers University validate the ability of the embryo to react to sounds and other stimuli. Books written as early as 1912 and 1914 mention these early recordings, labeling them cellular experiences, which in Dianetics we do not now know to be a correct label. The work of biologists in the field of embryology adequately validates the reaction capabilities of the embryo to stimuli. In Dianetics, engrams from the earliest periods have been checked with reality and have been found to have taken place. Many a parent, watching his child or teenager being processed, has been startled to hear from engrams the names of maids fired long before the child was born, or circumstances surrounding the marriage which were not particularly complimentary to the devotion of the parents to the letter of morality, and other matters which would not be otherwise known to the pre-clear. Some mothers, who may not have been as careful in their fidelity as their husbands expected, may even sacrifice the health of the child, who could otherwise be processed into better mental and physical condition, rather than have their husbands learn of these infidelities, which are unfortunately recorded word for word in the engrams of the child. Knowledge that these recordings exist and are valid and actual will discourage a below 2.0 individual from permitting her children to be processed. The auditor should always be wary of a mother who is actively trying to invalidate Dianetics to the husband or children. Case after case has been accumulated in which this invalidation process took place for no other reason than to hide data which the parent did not wish to be known. The only other reason an invalidation of Dianetics takes place after an individual sees it operate and understands it is that the aberrated condition of the mate or employee permits the invalidator to continue in control of that individual. This is highly discreditable, but will be found many more times than the auditor will like, and will be a considerable problem to him. Those who oppose processing either have something to hide or suppose they gain in some way by continuing authoritarian control of the pre-clear in question. Because he is running moments when the pre-clear was sick, distressed, injured, or otherwise disturbed, the auditor can expect to find himself viewing almost any state of health, neurosis, or psychosis at one or another stage of the pre-clear's advance to clear. These states will be very transitory, taking place only when the pre-clear is returned to an engram and, during the period, usually a few minutes or an hour, required to run that engram. Unless one understands that re-experiencing engrams is the re-experiencing of the very stuff of which insanity is made, one can become alarmed about this. The only really dangerous thing about the running of engrams is simply becoming alarmed. The pre-clear sent back into the basic area will roll into a fetal ball. The girl sent back to birth may get into mama's valence and scream loud enough time after time to disturb the neighbors a block away. The individual returned to when he had the mumps may be seen to have a very puffy face. The boy sent back to a severe sunburn may manifest redness and considerable discomfort until the engram is reduced. The temperature of the pre-clear will rise markedly when he is sent back down the track to a moment when he had a high fever. Reduction of the engram reduces the fever and reduces the aberrative effects which the pre-clear felt for years after that illness. A medical doctor, observing Dianetic processing for the first time, watches the pre-clear cheerfully lie down on the couch, listens to the auditor utter certain phrases, then sees the pre-clear become flushed and red, or otherwise apparently ill, for a brief time. A medical doctor observing this is alerted by his impulse to heal by his own methods, to a point where he will sometimes request that the session be stopped, because this pre-clear may be running a temperature, or seems to have severe cramps, or is generally uncomfortable. The pre-clear will be the first one to try to reassure the doctor, for the somatic that the pre-clear is experiencing is highly transitory. And the pre-clear, learning why and getting rid of the reason why he has had, for instance, migraine headaches most of his life, will not mind these manifestations, but indeed will rather welcome them, since they will shortly reduce. If the pre-clear is brought to present time before such an engram is reduced, the somatic and other manifestations which were mild at the place on the track where they first occurred will usually intensify. And if brought to present time by a poorly informed or cowardly auditor before the engram is reduced or erased, the pre-clear may experience some after-effects which are far less pleasant than running the engram. There is a motto governing this: the only way out of an engram is through it many times. If the file clerk presented an engram, it will reduce or erase, or the basic on its chain will reduce or erase. Thus it is up to the auditor to have confidence in his tools and to address his skill to the case, as detailed in this chapter. There is nothing very dangerous in running engrams except in failing to reduce them, or failing to reduce the earliest engram on the chain, or in invalidating them to the pre-clear, branding them delusion or some such thing. Anything which in a few moments can take a human being who is healthy and cheerful, run his temperature up 3 points, roll him up into a ball, or cause him to turn red all over is not something caused by delusion. You could even hypnotize a pre-clear, but don't ever let me catch you doing it, and tell him that he was going to manifest the very same things and he will not manifest them. Thus, these are not by power of suggestion, and there is no delusion mixed up in it. If you run a pre-clear back down the track into an engram, reduce the engram. Or if it starts to recess, demand the earliest engram on that chain and reduce that. If this earlier engram begins to recess, get an even earlier engram. Sooner or later you should get to the bottom of the chain, even when you have foolishly driven the pre-clear hard into a part of the bank the file clerk did not present. Don't go in for the processing of engrams half-heartedly. You can be careless about running locks without any casualty. You can even be somewhat careless about running secondaries without producing any serious condition in the pre-clear. But don't run the basic source, the engram, unless you mean to reduce it or to reduce the basic on its chain by recounting it perceptic for perceptic until it no longer bothers the pre-clear. Any new thing collects experimenters about itself, but one should not experiment with the running of an engram. One should continue on by rote until the engram is reduced. It is actually very easy to process an engram if you really mean to process it and are trying not just to find out whether or not engrams exist. One gentleman was curious about engrams, and without any study of the subject of processing them, much less a course at the foundation, told his wife to shut her eyes and go back to the time when she had measles. Unthinkingly, because this sort of thing simply did not happen before 1950, the wife closed her eyes and very shortly felt the warmth of measles. She was quite surprised. So was her husband. But they were even more surprised one day later when she broke out with a rash. Her husband promptly took her to the doctor, who said, "I would swear she had measles, except that she hasn't any respiratory symptoms and she hasn't any temperature." 2 days later, her rash disappeared of its own accord, as engrams placed into wrist stimulation in such wise normally will settle out. What this husband should have done in the first place was inquire from the file clerk if there was an engram ready to be run, and then ask for the identification of the engram, and then run it by rote until it was reduced. There is nothing that validates Dianetics to the pre-clear like being sent into a mass of somatics he did not suspect he had ever experienced. It is the person who is so heavily charged with N-theta that he cannot experience somatics who most seriously questions the validity of Dianetics. But even these individuals, seeing the effect of Dianetics on people who are higher up the tone scale and can experience somatics, will eventually concede. The person who does get somatics is most forcefully struck by the fact that this new thing, Dianetics, can do a thing which was never done before, namely, to change radically and at will the physical being of an individual. Not even in the days when witchcraft was rampant was one able to utter a chant and have immediate results follow. In Dianetics, words which are simply the words of one ordinary human being addressed to another can roll the other individual up into a ball and turn on a fever, or turn on a sunburn, or blur his vision, and create many other manifestations in the case which is fairly well up the tone scale. This is so marked, and the validity of Dianetics, if only in the terms of manifestation, is so strong that a physics professor at Columbia once came to the Foundation just to remark on the diabolical accuracy of Hubbard's predictions of human behavior. The 3 rules of processing engrams are: be surprised at nothing, always ask the file clerk, always reduce every engram you contact or the basic on the chain. Follow these and you can't get your pre-clear into very serious trouble. Further, there now exists lock scanning, a technique developed in the fall of 1950, which takes off the auditing that has thus been done. Theoretically, this permits the auditor to make almost any kind of blunder he wishes. After he has made some mistake, placed some engram into serious restimulation, wound his pre-clear up in a ball, found no way out of the situation, the auditor, theoretically, can lock scan off the auditing and relieve the restimulation which he has occasioned. The word theoretically is used here advisedly since, in cases which are below 2.0 on the tone scale, the auditor could place a pre-clear so thoroughly into an engram that no free theta would exist with which to scan off this auditing. This would be a very extreme case and would apply only when the pre-clear under treatment was a borderline or actual psychotic, rather than a person with a great deal of free theta who is yet below 2.0 on the tone scale. Always finish any session by scanning off the auditing anyway, but don't encourage yourself to make mistakes just because you can remedy them with lock scanning. In order to lock scan off auditing, one merely says, "Can we now scan off the auditing?" If the pre-clear's file clerk says no, the auditor should discover if some other chain has to be scanned before the auditing can be scanned off. And if this is the case, he proceeds to have it scanned. Ordinarily, the file clerk will say yes, and the auditor then directs the pre-clear to go back to the first moment of the session and to scan through the session to present time. He does this by requiring the pre-clear to tell him when he is at the beginning of the session and not permitting the pre-clear to start scanning until the auditor has said, "Begin scanning." The pre-clear scans through the session at any speed he desires, contacting the consecutive events of the auditing moment by moment, with his attention mainly directed to the exterior stimuli of the auditing session rather than to the engrams through which he has been run. This extroverts the pre-clear. Lock scanning of the session should be continued time after time, but only provided the auditor asks the file clerk after each sweep, "Should we scan the auditing again?" The file clerk will usually reply yes to this 2 or 3 times and will finally reply no. Then the auditor should ask the file clerk, "Can we end the session?" Usually the file clerk will reply yes. If the file clerk replies no, some earlier chain may have been accidentally thrown into restimulation, which will have to be lock scanned before the session can be ended in order for the pre-clear to be comfortable after the session, but this is rare. This ritual, when followed, undoes any errors in the session, unless, as has been said above, the auditor is dealing with a borderline or actual psychotic, in which case he should have identified the pre-clear as such on the tone scale chart in the first place, and should have audited the pre-clear as directed by the chart. On such individuals, engrams must never be run until they are advanced up the tone scale by establishment of affinity, communication and reality with the auditor, the establishment of contact with the environment, straight memory, light lock scanning, and the occasional running of a secondary. It should be remembered by the auditor that phrases in engrams are always literal. A phrase in an engram means exactly what it says, just as Simple Simon would have interpreted it the day he was so careful to step in every pie. For instance, the phrase contained in an engram, "I can't make it out," does not mean to the pre-clear on his first contacts that he cannot understand it or see it. It means simply that the pre-clear is unable to get out of the engram. The engram which has the phrase, "Beat it," is not interpreted by the analytical mind at first glimpse as meaning "get out," and is not a bouncer, but merely an aberrative phrase which might cause the pre-clear to repeat the phrase several times. The auditor, particularly when he is running engrams, should make a considerable study of the literalness of language. This is the main trouble with an engram, that it has command value which is literally interpreted. "I see what you mean" will cause the pre-clear to get a picture rather than to understand. This is true of both ordinary aberrative phrases and action phrases. The difference between an action phrase and an aberrative phrase is that the action phrase causes the pre-clear to go somewhere or stay somewhere, or not get in touch with something in terms of space and time. The aberrative phrase merely dictates conduct and is not nearly as serious to the auditor as the action phrase. The aberrative phrase has been inhibitive to the abilities of the pre-clear, but the action phrase is inhibitive to the auditor's ability to keep the pre-clear in this engram and run it. When action phrases are very active in engrams, causing the pre-clear to bounce or to come back to an engram, or to go later in the engram, or to become mixed up, or to find that the time track has collapsed around the engram as would happen in the case of any grouper on a heavily charged case. The auditor should not be running engrams in the first place, and is doing so only because he has failed to evaluate his pre-clear properly on the tone scale and to follow its directions about the case. Theoretically, one could strip a case of locks and secondaries without touching any engrams. However, there are such things as circuits, as will be covered later, and sometimes it will be necessary to run engrams on a heavily charged case in order to attack a circuit. But this would be an extraordinary proceeding and should only be done by a skilled auditor as trained at the foundation. The engram is suppressed and out of sight of the analyzer. This is a primary characteristic. At the shock of physical pain, or at the beginning of unconsciousness, the analyzer goes out of circuit and ceases to regulate bodily functions or record or think to a greater or lesser degree. The analyzer can be partly on or nearly off or entirely off during an engram. In any case, the perceptions are recorded in the reactive mind. The reactive mind was once known as the unconscious mind, but this terminology is highly misleading because the reactive mind is the mind which is always conscious, and the conscious mind is the mind which shuts off or goes unconscious. The total content of the reactive mind, then, is n-theta held down by physical pain engrams, which form the basis that causes later inturbulated theta to be permanently trapped into the reactive mind. In the course of a lifetime, because of physical pain engrams, the bulk of a person's free theta disappears from conscious view and is no longer available for computation, but reacts against the analyzer and I to disturb and enter hidden and arbitrary data and values into thinking. The physical pain in the reactive mind acts against the physical body of the pre-clear, and when the analyzer does not obey the engram commands, this pain turns on and aberrates the physical body. The task of the auditor, it is repeated here, is to exhaust from the reactive mind the accumulated n-theta by whatever means are indicated or possible, and to convert that n-theta into theta by the simple expedient of bringing the n-theta into memory or separating it from the physical pain which traps it. The task of the auditor is not simply to run engrams off a case. An auditor can make this mistake very easily because of his ambitiousness to create a clear. A clear, technically, is simply an individual from whom all physical pain engrams, all secondaries, and all aberrative locks have been erased. The clear can receive new engrams, but these must be of a very severe nature to be highly aberrative, because it is the early engrams on a case which produce the greatest aberration and effect on the individual. However, do not mistake the fact that heavy intentional engrams hammered by ferocious physical pain into a clear, should that clear have been basically low on endowment of free theta, may produce a psychotic break. But do not expect that engrams once erased and the n-theta exhausted from the reactive mind will then return in some strange fashion. They will not, once they are properly addressed and converted. It takes new physical pain to produce more engrams in a clear. A clear will, however, become inturbulated by the environment, but will inturbulate temporarily only and will suffer no after effect from the inturbulence, since there is nothing to trap the n-theta. Taking the locks and secondaries off a case, and perhaps a few engrams in the course of accomplishing this, produces a dianetic release. Thus the auditor can understand his point of concentration on the case. The progress of any pre-clear is measured by the pre-clear's rise on the tone scale, not by the number of engrams which are reduced or erased in the pre-clear. Authoritarian auditing on a low tone case can reduce engrams and erase them hour after hour for scores and scores and scores of hours, but can leave the case in such turbulence that the rise on the tone scale is relatively slight. The physical pain brings about the permanence of entrapment, but the auditor will find his greatest store of n-theta, which he can convert into theta, in secondaries and locks. An engram which has many locks and secondaries above it is completely buried and out of sight and unavailable to auditing. An engram which has almost no secondaries and locks has in it all its perceptics, which is to say that the pre-clear in recounting it returned to that point on the time track can see, hear, feel, and experience motion, moisture, and temperature, much as he did when he lived through the moment at the time it occurred. After the engram is keyed in thoroughly and accumulates secondaries and locks, the sharpness of the perceptics begins to disappear out of it, so far as the returned pre-clear is concerned, in direct ratio to the amount of n-theta which has charged this engram up. A very heavily charged engram, then, is not seen, heard, or felt by the pre-clear. An extremely heavily charged engram doesn't even exist as far as the pre-clear is concerned, but its presence is indicated by the fact that heavy secondaries and locks occur along a certain line. After these have been run and their n-theta converted to theta by the standard processing techniques delineated herein, the engram itself will emerge, and it or its chain, since engrams exist in chains, may only then be available for the auditor's address. But it should be understood that once this engram is thus available, the bulk of the n-theta which it contained has already been turned into free theta by lock scanning or the exhaustion of secondaries. And so the engram is relatively harmless, save that it will accumulate new secondaries and new locks. Further, it still retains the physical pain and its commands are still aberrative, and so it must be run. But the auditor should expect more change in the case from running locks and secondaries than from running physical pain engrams, even though engrams are the basic source of human aberration. The engram is pinned down and hidden from view, of course, by entheta. Entheta has many forms. It could be said to exist on the case by the virtue of enmest, which is to say that for the entheta released on the case, there will be a physiological reaction whereby the physical side of the organism undergoes some chemical alteration or gives off some chemical product. Oxygenation apparently has a great deal to do with the release of entheta. Tears and urine, sweat, body odors, glandular products come off of a case as the enmest accompaniment to the entheta released and physical energy as well. The auditor should not expect to find these enmest manifestations only in engrams. They are most marked in the discharge of secondaries and locks. This subject will be further covered under another column.